there's a great deal of similarity between the experiences of the Armenians and that of the Syrians, and indeed I would gather the similarities between these experiences and other immigrants from the Eastern Mediterranean. Although my paper won't bring these similarities out, don't let these obscure, let the differences that I'm going to talk about obscure the similarities. They're there, because indeed the Armenians and the Syrians came from a similar culture under rule by the Ottoman Turks, but they didn't leave, I think, for the same reason. This paper will deal primarily with the immigration and settlement of the Arabic-speaking immigrants before World War II, and in particular on the pioneers before World War I, because it's that generation that set the patterns for the settlement and the assimilation. I'm not going to deal with one community, I'm going to deal with very broad strokes, or the whole United States, if you will. And in particular, I'm answering the questions, why did they come? How did they get where they got? I mean, they were pretty well dispersed around the United States. And then how did they assimilate? And the answer to that third question is the fact that the most fundamental factor underlying the patterns of assimilation was pack peddling. It provided a first-hand, close-up introduction to American life. It served as a window to new ideas and values, and it raised expectations. They went into people's homes, they learned the language, they saw America, and this is how they raised their expectations. And the trade was the primary source of the income on which so many of the immigrant hopes and survival depended. Like other immigrant groups, these non-Western immigrants from the eastern shores of the Mediterranean came to an industrializing and urbanizing America in the last quarter of the 19th century to improve their economic status. Neither religious persecution nor economic oppression drove them off their land. They were not drawn by the promise of industrial jobs, but on the whole they came to peddle and to stay 2 or 3 years, convinced they would return to their homes much wealthier and prouder than when they came. Not since the German Jews of an earlier migration had an immigrant group so identified itself with the peddling trade. Several important background facts are essential before I continue. The overwhelming majority of the estimated 100,000 Arabic-speaking immigrants who were admitted between 1880 and 1914 originated in the Ottoman province of Syria. This included, of course, the semi-autonomous Sanjak of Mount Lebanon. That is that coastal mountain range, roughly north of Beirut, south of Tripoli, east of the Bekaa Plains. And I'm assuming, if you all read newspapers in the last year or two, you all know about where these places are. About 3,000 of them were from the province of Palestine, which at that time was included in the concept of Greater Syria. Now, I have a great deal of skepticism about statistics, and the kind of statistics that talk about immigrants and how many arrived and any of the breakdowns. And so these figures that I'm giving here are just something to work with handles to deal with. The immigrants were known as Syrian, and they called themselves Syrian. It was an identity which the immigrants adopted in the United States as a way of sorting themselves out in a society that was teeming with foreigners from different lands. It was a cultural reference and not a nationalistic one, since at the time of their migration there was no independent Syrian political entity with which they could identify. Nor did they identify themselves as Arabs, certainly not to the outside world, although they were fiercely proud of that heritage. The concept of Arab nationalism was as yet an idea being formulated mainly in Arab intellectual centers. Yet the Syrians left their land with a strong sense of who they were. Living for centuries in Ottoman Muslim society, they had come to identify themselves primarily by religion, sect, family, and place of origin. And even within that latter, the quarter of the sub-region of the province, the village or town, and the quarter within that town. Because they identified by sect, and the millet system in the Ottoman Empire divided them this way. And somebody with the name, say, of Maluf from Zahli, if they said that to another Arab, they would know exactly what they are. These are Melkites from Zahli, and especially if he said, well, I'm from the quarter of St. Nicholas or Madelies, they would know exactly who he was, how old how many families have been living in Zahri at that time. These things identified them. They brought that identity with them. About 90 to 95% were Christians. The rest were Muslims and Druze. And about 90% of the Christians were from Mount Lebanon. The government, society, and economy of the two parts of the Syrian province were very different. So it's hard to talk about them in a lump thing. These are all Syrian. Mount Lebanon, since 1861, had enjoyed, in the words of its historian Philip Hitti, a period of cultural flourish and economic prosperity, and achieved a state of security and stability unattained by any Ottoman province, European or Asian. It came to be acknowledged as the best governed, the most prosperous, peaceful, and contented country in the Near East, unquote. Its people benefited from low fixed taxes, restrictions on military conscription, and in general autonomy from direct Ottoman rule. It was open to the west, and rival missionary schools proliferated. Outside the mountain, Syria's large Muslim majority and its Christian and Druze minorities were ruled by Ottoman governors whose implementation of Ottoman reforms in the late 19th century fell far short of their stated goals. Corruption was rife, taxation was heavy, if not always oppressive, and conscription was always a threat. Although life was difficult, the Syrian economy was not depressed. The immigrants were, on the whole, off the land, owners of small disconnected plots of land who frequently had to supplement their incomes through craft and trade. They were poor, but they were not destitute. Syrians entering the United States compared favorably, somewhere in the middle range of all immigrants showing money at the ports of entry between 1899 and 1903. They averaged $32 per immigrant as compared, say, to $21 for Greeks and $12 for Poles. It was peddling that triggered the chain migration of Syrians, a chain migration that reached its annual peak of over 9,000 in 1913. A vast majority who came in the late 19th and early 20th century not only came to peddle, but did so, even if for a day or so after they arrived. Syrians who migrated after peddling had opened the way, for whatever reason, and those who came later, for whatever reason, to escape military service, to flee famine, which happened during the war, or because of discontent with post-World War I political development, all were really part of that chain migration. The basic virtues of peddling were several. Immigrants could earn immediately. It required no skills, no advanced training, few skills, not even language skills for that matter, and no capital, because they always bought things on credit here. And it suited their individualistic nature and their impermanence. It also spared them the uncertainties of finding work, of long job lines, and of layoffs. Ambition and temporariness were important twin factors in Syrian settlement and assimilation. Temporariness set their minds to accepting change and adjustment as necessary to achieving their get-rich-quick goal, while ambition set their minds to absorbing whatever might enhance that goal. That goal was all important. It was an obsession, as a matter of fact. So strong was the peddling magnet that Syrians left their villages in groups of up to 70 and more. Some have said 200. Most were single males, although a few women and married men joined them from the start. By the 1880s, the chain migration was well underway. Immigration records for 1910 show that the Syrians reported destinations in all 48 states and Alaska. As immigration between Syria and the New World accelerated, a network of self-contained, spontaneous, but interdependent entrepreneurial services developed. While this network mercilessly swindled the naive travelers, it also minimized the worst anxieties and adversities. The network began in the homeland and terminated at a peddler settlement somewhere in the United States. En route, countrymen were ready to assist the emigrants at every stage of the journey for a fee. On the other hand, the lost, the stranded, the ill, the anxious found solace and help among countrymen who spoke their language. Apparently, the benefits outweighed the harm. Even when they were misrouted, a lot of them ended up in Australia, in Brazil, in Canada, always thinking they were going to America, and arriving there thinking they were in America or Nayak. And they formed little nucleus of nuclei of attraction in these areas, and that's how they drew other people there, and so they're well distributed across the world, around the world. Anyhow, the benefits apparently outweighed the harm, because old-timers now look back on that network with no deep resentment. I mean, they'll chuckle about it when you talk to them about it. Its worst effects were avoided because many new immigrants were forewarned about the system's pitfalls by those who had preceded them. They would send letters back saying, go see, or don't, and be careful. Don't let anybody swindle you. One memoir said, when you get to New York, there'll be people who will bring up buggies and want to deliver you somewhere. Tell them no. In this one case, it turned out that indeed the buggies were for them, and they weren't being cheated. They were buggies from the man that they were supposed to meet. And they ended up carrying their bags to the hotel in New York while the buggies followed them. Anyhow, they were forewarned. And its existence, however, encouraged even the most faint-hearted to travel. So what you really had was an attraction, a constant movement of this chain action. It's not certain when the Syrians discovered their entrepreneurial Eden in America. Informed opinion and a document I found in the National Archives in Beirut date it from the 1876 Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. As a matter of fact, the Sultan had sent an order to his governors of the various provinces at the time saying, please encourage your tradesmen to go again to show their wares at an exposition. And the governor of Zahli, which were the documents that I was working with at the time, said, we have notified the people, and we will tell them, and we will inform you again, and we will tell them again what to do and send you their names and so on. This is dated 1878, and the assumption is, of course, that they had been here in 1876. And then newspapers here in the United States do talk about a Turkish pavilion in 1876. So that's probably when they first came and what they saw really excited them, I guess, because whether these trailblazing businessmen or tradesmen who attended the exposition deliberately recruited countrymen, or whether word of their successes stimulated immigration, that is, along the word of mouth along the grapevine of extended families, will never be known. But it is clear that they were soon overtaken by an influx of villagers seeking their fortune in America. It is not known why they chose to peddle, but some of the old-timers will say they learned the trade in America from the Jews. Glowing letters of quick and undreamed of wealth containing proof in the form of remittances were the best recruiters, surpassed only by the visiting immigrants who swaggered in Western clothes and chains and the fedora hats and boasted of bounty. Suppliers, too, may have sent letters because the suppliers were proliferating rapidly in America and peddlers were arriving in droves. And suppliers were undoubtedly veteran peddlers who in the 1880s and 90s had accumulated surplus capital and who had a little more entrepreneurial courage and shrewdness than their companions. At some point it must have occurred to some of them to lay down their packs, choose a suitable site, and enter the business of supplying peddlers. And then, sending letters home to the village or nearby villages and saying, come out and peddle. And this pattern was repeated with such regularity that a network of suppliers and their peddling settlements filled the nation. This network was a crucial factor in the distribution of Syrians in the United States. And I wish I had the time to sort of follow one of these settlements, because I traced some of them, but I don't have the time to do it. The mother of Syrian peddling settlements was undoubtedly the Syrian colony in New York. It was also certainly the initial stimulus for the chain migration. In 1892, the New York Daily Tribune described a few blocks close to the port area in Manhattan as a thriving community where merchants, importers, backroom manufacturers of groceries and jewelry were supplied to both peddlers and suppliers. It had a society for the education of Syrian immigrants and an Arabic newspaper by 1892. From this colony, peddlers radiated out in all directions with their small notions cases, which is really the primer of peddling, these little notions cases, little drawers in them, and packs filled with up to 200 pounds of anything that a farm wife or a housebound town dweller might need or desire: clothing, linen, ginghams, notions for sewing, and notions for bric-a-brac, jewelry, icons, anything they could pick up and load into it. They followed their instincts or the advice of veterans deeper and deeper into the country, returning periodically to resupply or to revitalize their spirits among their people. A chart of known peddling settlements shows that they were more numerous in eastern and midwestern states, sprinkled in the south and west, and highly scattered in the Rocky Mountain areas. The overall network is made up of sub-networks based on immigrants, place of origin, sect, and kin. Kin attracted kin, villager attracted villager, and so you have this sort of trail of settlements from one village and sect. Sub-networks were the result of splintering and re-splintering of settlements. That is, there'd be a settlement, and then somebody would have the courage to go on a little bit and settle down, and create his own settlement and attract peddlers and so on, and it would keep on going. Their proliferation opened up work opportunities for more and more new arrivals. Several Christian and one major Druze sub-network has been identified. I will briefly identify some of them. I was going to skip this part, but I think I'll tell you about it. Fort Wayne, Indiana was a prototype of pioneer settlements, and its founder was probably the prototype of pioneer suppliers. He and his two brothers were brought to Fort Wayne on their father's second trip to America in 1887. Fort Wayne may have been the town chosen by the father before he returned to his village and then came back on the second trip as a place to open a peddler's supply store, and he probably went back to bring his family so he could do this, his son, for example. Salem was the most enterprising of the sons. This is the oldest son. By 1890, he had purchased a building with 3 stores, each with rooms above it or in the back. Then he began to recruit peddlers. He sent letters to his village and those around it where he had friends and relatives. By 1895, Fort Wayne was a vigorous settlement estimated by the Eastern Orthodox bishop, who took a census of his communicants in the United States, to have 424 Orthodox only, okay? Which was second only to the community of 575 in New York City. They came from many villages, which surrounded his own near Damascus, and they were met at the train by Label, of course, to Salem the sheriff, at the train by Salem himself, an Orthodox. Salem was also an astute entrepreneur. He sought lucrative markets to which he sent his peddlers. Booming mining towns, industrial towns along railways, because the railroads were opening up new areas at that time, such as Bloomington and Spring Valley, Illinois, Grand Rapids, Michigan, Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and a few others. Among those he sent to Bloomington were some peddlers from a village called Ain Arab in Syria, which was not far from where this supplier originated. By 1895, it was an Ain Arab settlement. By the turn of the century, it had spawned Ain Arab settlements in Cedar Rapids, Sioux City, Iowa, in North and South Dakota, in and around Minneapolis, Minnesota. Collectively, the sub-networks facilitated and furthered the natural tendency of wider distribution of a peddling people. On the other hand, the pattern of recruitment set the character of the permanent communities that were to succeed in settlements and left legacies that continue to reverberate in the American-speaking and the Arabic-speaking communities today. First, an immigration of single individuals who believed themselves to be on a temporary sojourn, left behind the traditional guardians of community values and mores, and the absence of guidance from religious institutions and the traditional secular leadership, as well as from the authority of the family, and the loosening of communal sanctions for as long, in some places, as a generation, weakened any attempts to preserve old world values and customs. Leaders trying to recreate Syrian institutions in permanent communities in the 1920s and later found the force of the new far stronger than the authority of the old. Second, the family/village emphasis in the recruitment process perpetuated the deeply ingrained religious and sectarian divisions early neighborhoods, inhibited, if they did not preclude, a unified national ethnic community by perpetuating as many Syrian, frequently rival identities on American soil as there were on the identity grid in the homeland. The pioneer peddling period was one of discovery, adventure, and colonization. It is also one of fatigue, loneliness, bewilderment, and pain. The experiences of this period are preserved in scores of peddling anecdotes in which cunning and wit overshadow the memory of hardships. At once bitter and humorous, even the most biting and embarrassing stories were shared with comrades in the settlement. In sharing them, the rebuffs and insults were objectified and trivialized. Dignity that was lost among strangers was restored. The stories were and remained irrelevant and incomprehensible to those who had not shared the peddling experience. Only a Syrian peddler, for example, would find humor in the bewilderment of a boy who was being throttled by a Norwegian farmer in North Dakota. The boy had grabbed and kissed the farmer's beard, importuning him for a place to sleep. It was of course, what he would have done in such a desperate circumstance in his own village. Take two, the fury of the boy who, a day after making no sales and facing shouts of "go home, smallpox," railed his brother when he got back home, shouting at him, "No one would buy from me. No, why did you give me this small box?" Because there is no sound, P sound in Arabic. And they go on. I mean, I've collected something like 60 or 70 of these marvelous peddling stories. Newcomers anxious to learn could and often did set out to peddle only after a few hours of briefing in the company of veteran relatives or friends. Syrian men and women commonly left the settlement in groups and peddled in pairs for companionship and safety. They might head for nearby towns and return to the settlement in the evening. Some might take a train to some distant point and walk back, canvassing towns and farm areas en route. These might remain away for days or weeks. Some might range further and longer in rigs. Still others, the most courageous and adventurous, might roam on foot carrying their packs from farmhouse to farmhouse and might roam, state to state and remain 6 to 12 months. Peddlers peddled in all kinds of weather. The anecdotes tell of frozen extremities, of skirts that slashed women's ankles, of thieves and nervous farmers with nervous trigger fingers, and dogs sleeping in lice-infested haystacks and smelly barns and much more. But on the road, they learned English quickly, they taught themselves, or were taught by their friendly customers. Roaming in and out of its urban and rural regions and the various sections of the country, the Syrian peddlers' knowledge of America was broadened. Frequently, they were bewildered and amused by what they saw: 4th of July celebrations, local political campaigns, minstrel sideshows, religious revivals, and hooded people burning crosses. Few immigrants groups from remote cultures had the opportunity to learn so much about America, the diversity of its regional manners and tastes, and on few immigrants did American culture have the opportunity to impose itself so directly and so immediately. A pack peddler in the urban streets and country roads of the turn of the century America should have been an anachronism. A revolution in communications and transportation was bringing urban and rural sectors closer together. Small towns along railroad lines were becoming small industrial cities, and markets for new products were expanding. New sales techniques, such as Montgomery Ward's small mail order houses, were being advanced. Yet working in the open spaces of the incomplete economic structure that was being forged by corporate and financial institutions, the peddler performed a special economic function that was hardly noticed in the onrush of progress. Persuasive and tenacious, roaming into the most remote and forbidding regions of the country, peddlers promoted commerce. They took the products of small American industries to remote markets, thus expanding these markets and encouraging production. There's no way to calculate how many women peddled, nor the value of their contribution to the peddling trade, either in monetary terms or in the general economic advancement of Syrians in the United States. Many, by their energies, ingenuity, sacrifices, and inner strength, staved off poverty for their families and failure for their men when the latter's nerve faltered or failed. They were skillful at selling, and because they were more trusted than men and more pitied by their customers, they were economic assets. Their expanded economic role gradually freed them from some of the old world customs. They would turn their newfound talents and sense of independence to community building when Syrians settled permanently in middle-class neighborhoods. They would organize societies, raise funds to build places of worship, and urge their husbands and sons up the economic ladder. The hardships of the road neither depressed nor discouraged most Syrians. Hard work, thrift, self-denial reaped tangible rewards and spared the Syrians entrapment at the bottom of American society. It was not uncommon for peddlers to save, and their frugality was legendary, to save as much as $1,000 or $5,000, and many saved much more after sending remittances home. Invariably, they used it to open up a family business. If figures were available, they would undoubtedly show that the Syrian peddling trade mushroomed into a multi-billion-dollar business between 1880 and 1914. To try to verify that opinion would be difficult, but using the most exaggerated kind of figures, low figures, I found that peddlers collectively netted a minimum of $30 million annually, and that an individual peddler's earnings averaged $1,000 annually, compared to somewhere between $400 and $600 for average earnings for full-time people in manufacturing, mining, and retail sales. The pioneer supplier held the pivotal role in the economic and social life of Syrian peddling settlements. He was a veteran peddler or shrewd entrepreneur who led his men. To them, he was a countryman, friend, counselor, protector, banker, and because resistance to any individual was inevitable, he was sometimes an adversary. Each village or sectarian group in the settlement might have its own supplier. A supplier might have recruited some of his peddlers, even in some cases might have advanced the fare to come in advance. He might have arranged for their housing, but he was not their employer and he was not their employment agent. Suppliers and peddlers formed an interdependent relationship based on mutual economic goals and the canons of tradition. Among his men, he was first among equals, and since peddlers and suppliers and peddlers usually originated from the same socio-economic class in Syria, class distinction in America was hollow. Family name and noble ancestry, no matter how often it was asserted, counted for little, since almost anybody with any ambition and a little capital could become a supplier. Although the supplier's leadership was validated by the dependence of his peddlers on him, no special title attached to him, nor was abject obedience demanded. He had to earn the loyalty of his people. His leadership was contingent on his fulfilling his followers' expectations and his upholding the traditional values. In particular, the value of nobility of character, as demonstrated through the qualities of munificence and magnanimity, and these are often called generosity and hospitality. The very canons of tradition that validated his leadership also militated against his excesses. Judging from the testimony of the pioneers, exploitation was not existent. The peddlers freely entered into a business relationship with the supplier, and they were free to terminate it at will. If a peddler and a supplier disagreed, it was frequently the supplier, because he was stable, the peddler was itinerant, who made concessions, since his status and honor, as well as his income, was at risk. Maintaining order and mediating conflicts were undoubtedly the most trying aspect of the supplier's leadership. Peddlers lived often 6 or 8 to a room. Crowding also was conducive to conflict, but moreover, a value system that emphasized personal rivalry, individualism, and valor tied to family honor impinged as compellingly on leaders as it did on followers. So the potential for conflict was always there. But the supplier always managed to work it with some kind of equilibrium between his own interests and the interest of the peddlers. It was inevitable that peddling would become virtually obsolete before World War I. Because it hastened the assimilation process, it contributed to its own obsolescence. Peddlers learned English quickly, accumulated capital, acquired new values and directions. Economically, its unexpected financial returns allowed the Syrians to cross the bridge from one kind of enterprise to a higher one. Socially, the deep satisfaction with America which accompanied their success in peddling inclined them to become permanent citizens. Any barrier that Syrian leaders would later erect against Americanization of their community would be built on the quicksands of the peddling experience. As more women emigrated to peddle, to marry, to join their menfolk, it was inevitable that the roving peddlers would exchange their nomadic life for stability and continuity of the virtues of home and family in their adopted land. At the same time that the Syrian peddler was outgrowing his trade, American society was outgrowing his services. Few Syrians mourned the end of peddling. They only mourned the adventure, the camaraderie of the pioneering period. Thank you.
Well, that was an excellent concluding paper. Shows, I guess, that everybody didn't go to the factories or else to Fresno. Well, here you have it, and then each one of the, I must commend each one of the panelists for their timely papers in more ways than one, and so we now have some time for discussion and questions. And let me just repeat: if you have a comment, fine. If you have a speech, we'll save that for the next conference. So the floor is open. Would you direct your questions to the individual panelists? Yes, the young lady.
Yes, I have a question for Dr. Joan. I want to know why so many you've got any research in that area.
Of course. They originally went to attempt to convert the Turk to Christianity. This failing, they turned their attention to the Armenians. And that was the original purpose of their visit, to attempt to convert the Turk. And also to bring a measure of enlightenment or education to the area. Many institutions, colleges, owe their beginning to the American Protestant movement in that part of the world. But I'm convinced their original purpose was to convert the Turk.
Was there a particular reason why there were so many? It seems like 275. Is the number you mentioned?
This seemed to be the most fertile area for them to be met. And they essentially found fertile ground for the seeds they were planting. They were not rejected. Armenians particularly seemed to follow their precepts. So large numbers of them went. For example, Mount Holyoke College produced particularly missionaries, and there were 60 of them in the area of Turkey, bringing all kinds of light. In other words, they were received. They were not rejected. Would be my answer.
I have two questions to ask to Mrs. Naff. Didn't the Syrians have any religious affiliation when they came to the United States? Or affiliation with did they keep any kind of connection with their church in the old country? That's one. Secondly, you constantly spoke of Syrians. Could you identify the elements in this term in terms of the communities now we know in Lebanon and Syria? The Maronites and the Syrian Jacobites and Greek Arabs and so on. And you mentioned some Druzes. How about the other kinds of Muslims? Did they come at all?
Yes.
The Shiites or Sunnis and Alawis?
Okay, that's a large question. I'll try to be brief. Time didn't allow me to go into those details. Indeed, they came identifying with their religion very strongly. But the Christians came, as I said, about 90%, 90 to 95 were Christians from Mount Lebanon. And they were mostly...
Were they Maronites?
And many of them were Maronites. One can't tell how many of each. They were just Christians. Since they came from Lebanon, one would assume that the Maronites were the most numerous. There were a lot of Orthodox, Greek Orthodox, Melkites, which is the Greek Catholic. There's some Jacobites, but we don't. There are very few. They don't have many churches, and it's hard to count how many. And they did have an identity, and they did build their churches here. It was difficult to build churches here because they were so dispersed. Most of the churches started on the East Coast, where the communities were Boston, New York, and so on. Before 1920, there were all over the United States something like 120 churches only. That's all, because they were so dispersed. Now to answer your question about the Muslims and Druze. The Muslims and Druze came, nobody knows how many, because everybody was listed as Turks in Asia, and I imagine the Armenians were too, were they not? And they weren't identified as Syrians until 1899. In 1899, perhaps because so many of that category called Turks in Asia were Syrians, at least coming from that eastern part of the Mediterranean, the immigration department added a classification called Syrian. And under that, I imagine there were Palestinians and God knows what else, maybe even some, I don't know. But the Druze that came were very few, and the Muslims. One, they were a little bit reluctant to migrate into a Western Christian society. They'd already had their experiences with the West in their own country because of the interference of the Europeans with the Ottoman Empire and in their own land. The Westerners divided the Christians, as a matter of fact, they divided them religiously between Muslims and Druze and the Christians. And then within the various sects, the Russians supported the Orthodox, the French the Maronites, the Austrians tried to capture the Melkites from the French, and so on. So there was a lot of that. But the Muslims didn't come because they were afraid they wouldn't find their own, wouldn't be able to conduct their own Muslim way of life in Christian country, that the Christians may be hostile to them. The Druze, in fact, were sworn to oath that they wouldn't leave. And if they were going to leave, they would have to take release their women and so on, or have to come back in 2 years. There were Druze, however, who did. A mere handful, a few hundred. Not even, I don't know how to count them, except to find their communities now and let them guess for you, and the guesses are very broad. Did that answer all your questions? No Arlelis came, incidentally, that I know of.
I'd like to address my question to Dr. Aharonian and Professor Kulanja. In your discussions of Armenian immigration to your communities, Worcester and New Jersey, I'm curious to know, though there was a self-reinforcement in terms of discipline and in terms of being proud Armenians, but I'd like to address my question in terms of the leadership within these communities. I'm not necessarily referring to political leadership, though you did both allude to the political conflicts and its effect on the church. But can you address yourself to the kind of leadership that these immigrants looked up to? The church was just being established, as you mentioned at the time. What was the leadership? What did these immigrants look up to in terms of leadership in the communities during the periods that you spoke of?
From my interpretation, they served within themselves. Their own role models were their peers. Living together in a fraternity-like quarters, they sort of monitored each other. It would be considered very inappropriate for them to get into trouble with the law. They would ostracize one another. And I think this moral force within themselves was an extremely strong force for them to toe the line, to behave, to act in appropriate ways. That the names of Armenians would not be considered bad in society. When one stopped to think of it, they really didn't get into trouble with the law officials at all. This was an unheard of thing, as it was for them to be in trouble with the welfare officials. They were their own monitoring system. They accepted this upon themselves. And to answer your question, I would say that force, plus one other one. When they had left Turkey, the young men particularly were reminded very, very strongly by their elders over there, and I think that force still existed, the external force from the old country, that they must behave themselves, that they were to act stalwartly, and never to allow their behavior to be a detriment to themselves or to their race.
I'd like to comment on that question. One is that I think the leadership in each of the communities was permeated by the fact that, as Dr. mentioned, the role models. But in addition to that, the fact that the clergy was looked upon with high esteem, number one. Number two is the fact that military heroes were also, in the New Jersey experience, those who contributed to the leadership of each community. And thirdly, the economic leadership came from those individuals who made it outside the settlements, such as the Hakimian, the Kooshian, and the Karagouzians. They made it by hiring non-Armenians, making it first small time, so to speak, and then moving on to their own industries. Most of the employees of the Karagouzian plant in Freehold were non-Armenians, and the same is true with the High Kooshian experience. Although individually they helped Armenian institutions to develop, and they helped individual Armenians who needed a loan, say. In fact, the case of the Hakimian family was that in many of the loans there was audits by the government to find out how Hakimian was able to keep his record straight, and meanwhile making these loans to needy Armenians and so forth. But I think those are the three elements. The fact that there was the role model, whether it be in the clergy taking on the leadership with the respect they had, and the fact that military leadership, whether it be Armenian leadership heroes or American heroes, is another. And thirdly, the fact that the community also was influenced by those Armenians outside the community who were making it in the system, who acted as role models also.
May I make a comment?
Sure, comment.
I just want to throw, I don't know, I imagine that Armenian family life is similar to Arab family life, since they're all from the same area. But to the role of the family was very tight, the Arab family was very closely knit. But more important than anything else, it was the honor of that family that the individuals in that family worked for. So if you did anything wrong, if you got in trouble with the law, if you didn't succeed or anything else, you were really harming the honor of the family, the name of the family. It was all done in the name of the family. And that really was a very strong controlling device in America for these young men.
I wanted to recognize Dr. Megurian.
Yeah, my question is to Dr. Duranian and Professor Duranja. We learned that the Armenians in Ontario came here in a temporary sense to work and ultimately go back to the homeland. I wonder to what extent they found that Armenians who came to Worcester and to New Jersey came here temporarily with the thought that they would earn money or get an education or a skill and ultimately go back to the homeland. And to what extent did they feel that they were really coming to this country and building a new life here when they first came? Obviously, the supply was extended before 1916.
I think that question has to be put in its framework. For example, after the 1895 massacres, return to Turkey became much less possible. But before that time, obviously the primary concern was to only stay for a period of time. And there were Armenian leaders. For example, the third priest in Worcester admonished anyone who came over here with his family as being a traitor, that he shouldn't think of himself as being a permanent settler here, that his primary purpose was to come, earn money, go back over and over again. Also this feeling of being a traitor to the cause by staying was very, very, very strong, until return was impossible for other reasons, for political reasons.
I have to go along with Dr. Duranian on that in perspective and in regard to the time period that the immigrants came, that before the 1895 experience is why the immigrants were more readily transient, whereas especially those among intellectuals who studied in theological seminaries, and I'm not quite sure of the number of those missionaries that went back to Turkey to answer this other lady's question regarding the fact that many of them might have been Armenians who might have been counted in the number of missionaries that went back. So after 1895, why it was less likely until the First World War, of course 1915, that perhaps some went back to liberate the homeland. But by and large, the immigrants came to earlier, those male immigrants that came earlier than 1895 for temporary reasons, and of course to migrate back. And of course after 1895, when the church played a far more prominent role, to stay. It seems that one pattern seems to be evident in the amount of the research, and that is to say that many of the larger immigrant groups that came, the Irish, the Italians, and so forth, came as a result of their church developing first and attracting other groups, actually the immigrants coming first and then building the church as a secondary factor. Whereas in the Armenian case, it seems as though after 1895, once the church was established, the church seemed to attract immigrants. But that may be more of an interpretation than a historical fact.
I recognize Professor Galenian.
Dr. Naff, can you give us some comments about two things? One with regard to peddling occupation of our immigrants in contrast to what Armenians did, to whatever degree we can. And then secondly, in terms of, let's say, the 1895 massacre of the Armenians and later, do you see any differences in the communities because of that particular kind of experience with the Armenians as compared to the Syrians?
Well, I think that it would be difficult for me to comment. I'm learning about the Armenian during this session, and it's very stimulating. The major difference, I think, is that the Syrians could always go back. There was nothing to deter them. They may not have liked it, no, they may not have liked what the taxation, say, in Syria as opposed to Lebanon. They did have a nostalgia for it, and they always wanted to go home. They were free to do so if they wanted to. They were, they didn't think of the homeland, it seemed to me, except in nostalgic terms, but what was happening to them in this country was so exciting to them that they would go back on trips. They would go back, to visit, to boast, in fact. Look what we've done, and put a red tile roof on the old house and get all the praise and prestige for it, come back here and make some more money. Because this was sort of like, they were mining this like a gold mine. They didn't have, they were not in any way, it seemed to me, talking to over 100 old-timers, interviewing them, that there was this kind of depression. We were thrown out of our homeland, we were oppressed, we were persecuted. There was always an optimism about it, an excitement, an adventure. That's the difference that I see, certainly, in between the two experiences. Now, why the Armenians did not go into peddling and the Syrians did, I think is fortuitous. I think, who knows? I think the fact that some of these tradesmen came to both the Paris fair, the exposition in Paris and the one in Philadelphia, must have, they're born entrepreneurs to begin with. I mean, one economist, Lebanese economist, said about the Lebanese, meaning Syrians, the whole lot as they identify, said if they thought they could make a living on Mars, they'd migrate to it. And they were entrepreneurs in their own land. They came here to be entrepreneurs. This is their entrepreneurial Eden. When they found somebody said, come sell, they came and sold and made money. And then they began attracting people. Some of the memoirs, some of the interviews that I had from these people talking about 70, 80, 200 men leaping down the port to leave, to come out and pedal is remarkable.
Dr. Meyer, can I just make this comment about the question of migrating back? If you study the immigration quotas of 1921, 24, etc., many Armenians who came to this country were rejected based on the national quota. When they did go back, they did not necessarily go back to the Ottoman Empire or to Turkey. They went back to France, to England, to some of the other countries of the world and established the homelands of the diaspora, so to speak. And this contributed in another way to the Armenian legacy. It is interesting that they were anxious, yet there are cases of Armenians who made the trip twice because of rejection, whether it be at Ellis Island or any other port of entry.
Mr. Aftandilian.
I'd like to ask Dr. Kooshian a question about the Ottoman Constitution of 1908 and how that might have affected the Armenian community in Canada. Did you find that there was a large migration of Armenians back to Armenia after the 1908 Constitution, or were economic conditions so bad there that they could not go back?
Well, actually, that's a very interesting question, because 1908, with the Ottoman Constitution, as you know, that was not promulgated in 1908. It was an old constitution from, I think, 1876 or so. But it did give freedom of travel. And what happened in Kali, as far as I could tell, a lot of people who had been caught in Constantinople, a lot of Kalisis who had been caught in Constantinople had been deported out to different places, Bulgaria, Romania, wherever, came back after 1908 to Kobe. Conditions were still not good. They still needed outside money. And so they migrated to North America, especially after the Balkan War started. So that it seems to me that as far as travel restrictions are concerned, the loosening up of these problems enabled a back and forth. It's landlocked and it's mountainous. It's very difficult to get out. It wasn't like Lebanon where exit was relatively simple. So that it's, there were still problems. Well, it was compared to Kobe, it would have been. So there were still problems with exit, but it did enable them to leave. So that, and it also enabled them to come back.
Are we allowed to ask questions?
Of course.
Sorry, I don't want to off different, but I must ask Dr. Gabrielian a question about discrimination in this country. In Canada, because I want to see if there was a similarity with America. It seemed to me that you talked about Canadian ruling against Asiatic immigration. Did that parallel what America did? Was the Canadian immigration working with the Canadian immigration working with American immigration to have the same kind of restrictions?
I don't think it was even more restrictive. So that where we were charging, the Canadian government was saying that they had to have $200 upon entry. That was not a head tax. In America it was what, $25? $50, whatever. So that there was this, so that a lot of, so many Armenians would, if they were heading for Canada, would go to the United States first and then smuggle themselves across the Naff border.
The Syrians will tell you that they went to Canada first.
Oh, that happened too. That happened too. Quite a number of them came to Canada and then they were smuggled into the United States. So it's very difficult to generalize, and certainly statistics aren't readily available that you can figure out how many.
But did the Armenians take that as discrimination, that they were being discriminated against?
Sure. And so were the Syrians. There were very strict regulations. But they bypassed them by smuggling. There was a terrific traffic coming from Newfoundland to Nova Scotia, and they were bringing Syrians, Armenians, all the Ottoman people were coming in at night by boat, as if they were working, as if they were crewmen on these boats, and they were being dropped off at the Dominion Coal Factory at night. And then, the Canadian officials had no jurisdiction over this particular territory, and hundreds came in that way.
I'm always impressed by their shrewdness and cleverness.
Oh, they were very clever.
I have two more questioners to be recognized. Professor Minasyan and then Svajian will have the last word.
I wonder if I may be so presumptuous not to few comments. The young lady asked a question regarding the missionary influence in Armenia. I think we should know that, as was pointed out, although not carried through, that while the initial concern or objective was to convert the Turks to Christianity, and they saw that was a failing proposition, they found that fertile field of Armenian Christians. And what they discovered among these Armenian Christians was a lack of knowledge of the Bible and the fact that Armenians just didn't question their religion. This was, I think, for people back in the centuries. And so this appealed to the intellectual, should we say, of the intellectuals among the Armenians, and they provided them with schools, and these schools were the first schools in Armenia that provided them with opportunity to learn English and about America. And the church initially welcomed the missionaries into Armenia, but when they realized that they began to convert these Armenians, they were definitely opposed to it. And the other issue is about leadership. The leadership here was also provided by those who had a basic English education from the old country, and these people in this country were those who knew the ropes, showed the way, etc. And coincidentally, I've just been here a few days, I looked at the Boston Globe, and I saw the obituary column, as my sister pointed out to me, the passing away of Miss Nora Kanyan. She was 94 years old. She played a great role in the World War I, the 20s and 30s, in the Lawrence Methuen area, yeshivas at one-woman committee sponsored by the YWCA, YMCA, to meet the newcomers into that area and teach them the fundamentals of Americanism and where to settle and so on. And this was the role played by the professionals. Those who were the professionals in our communities were the leaders, because they looked up to, number one, they knew the language, the doctors, the lawyers, etc. And by the same token, there were those who made about education, but they had that personality and that self-confidence to assert themselves, and they were looked upon for that leadership.
Thank you very much. I've recognized Svajian, and I think we have some announcements. So Svajian, and then a question over here. Those will be our last two, and then we have some announcements. Is that correct, Monica?
Yes.
Oh.
I just would like to add a short note on Mr. Diranyan's reference that in 1898 the American Armenian community was created as a diocese by Permian Irene. Now we have got to know that there is no noticeable record of any East Armenians coming to the United States. So all Armenians came from West Armenia, that is the Ottoman area, because probably of the influence of missionaries. But of course the East Armenians also had missionaries, but they were different kinds of missionaries from different churches, from different lands. Anyway, that's not the point. And it would be perfectly natural, and it was, that all Armenians in the United States were under the jurisdiction of the Patriarchate of Constantinople. During the 2 decades of the 19th century, these political movements, and in particular Tashnak and Ramgavar, Kinship and Tashnak Sagan parties were created, and this movement of liberation in Turkey itself. Naturally, those who came from Ottoman Empire to the America, they kept their connection not only with their church, but also with their political affiliations or political problems. Now what happened? The Sultan called the Patriarch of Constantinople, I think it was sometime early 90s, and told him, you close the mouth of your people in the United States. You control them because they were sending money overseas, they were agitating against the Turks. Little groups which didn't have really much meaning what they did in Worcester or in New Jersey, but nevertheless it was even then irritating for the Turks. And Armenian was the Patriarch and who was being pressed by the Turkish government to control his people in Worcester and New Jersey, all over the place. He had no recourse except asking the Catholicos that please take the United States over yourself, so I'll get out of this trouble. So Permian acceded to this, wrote this contact, so Armenian could go and tell the Sultan, now look, they are not under my jurisdiction, I can't do anything, I can't tell anything to them, so I am not responsible for what the American Armenians were doing. Early in the 90s, a library was established in Worcester, and because of this struggle between Tashnak and Ramgavars, who had come over, of course, certain nationalistic novels were placed, and because Svajian was under the authority of the Constantinople Patriarch, he prevented the putting of these nationalistic books in this library. There was a big row, there was much fight and so on, whether those books of Rafi and other people should be placed on the bookshelves or not. Until such time, when the Catholicos took over, Svajian and all the other clergymen were relieved of the duty of stopping these revolutionaries or helpers of the revolution in the Ottoman Empire.
Exactly. Thank you very much.
I
One
just
last-
wanted to make a comment relative to the missionaries going over there. And actually, the missionaries, the reasons for the missionaries getting them, because we're very good fear of the economic domination and penetration and some of the interesting things that happened because the missionaries did go over.
Fine, thank you very much. I think that this, with the exception of some announcements, winds up our first session, and I want to thank you all for your close attention and also for the panelists. But before you move, there will be some announcements, great moments.
I'll just take a few moments here. I'd like to remind all of the panelists that would like to have copies of their presentations for consideration of cases.
Well, I think we could begin this afternoon's session on social institutions. It's a great pleasure for me to be here, certainly, and I look forward to a stimulating meeting. I gather that the chairman is expected to say something to introduce the general topic of the sessions. I think I will waive that privilege in this case because I haven't had an opportunity to read the papers beforehand, so I really don't know what they're going to say, and thus anything I could say to introduce them, I'm afraid, would be so horrendously vague and vacuous as to be worthless. You know, Armenian institutions are very interesting and we should know more about them. So consider that function waived. On the other hand, I might, at the end of the four papers, steal back a little of that time to offer a couple of general observations about them. The ground rules are simple. We have four speakers, each of whom is allotted 30 minutes. We will have a break between the second and third papers so that you can stretch your legs, but we will try to get going again quickly so that there will be ample opportunity for questions and challenges from the floor. And I should warn my distinguished panelists that as an old-time high school debater, I have vivid memories of giving talks where looking at someone in the corner with a list of time cards, and they would hold up 4, and then 3, 2, 1, 1/2, and then the really obnoxious ones, when it hit 0, they would stand up and look affronted. Well, I won't quite do that, but I will try to warn speakers 5 minutes from their allotted time, and I will cough or something when the 0 moment approaches. Our first speaker is Joan Bamberger of Wellesley College. She received her PhD in anthropology from Harvard in 1967 and devoted much of her early years as a researcher to working in Latin America, particularly Brazil. However, since 1981, she has turned her attention to a subject somewhat different, I think you will agree, from the Indians of Brazil, and has been working on the Armenians of Watertown, doing a social history of that community. And her paper is called Family and Kinship in an Armenian American Community. Joan.
Well, Steve has just done something an anthropologist never does, and that divulge the name of the town in which he works.
Yankee City, Armenian City, all right.
In fact, historians usually complain that they can't use anthropological data because the name of the town is disguised, the population is never disclosed.
Are you speaking from there? Yes,
I
will
see.
bring the
I should be up there. Okay.
Yes, please.
In fact, it's part of our tradition that we tend to cover up the places that we've worked in, and we never divulge the names or the addresses of informants. Although from time to time I do get asked for such things, I always say no. I would also like to say at the outset that the kind of field work that an anthropologist does is quite different from that of either a historian or a sociologist. We, as a rule, don't go house to house taking questionnaires with us or training graduate students to do that work. Traditionally, we have moved into our communities and spent a lot of time getting to know the people, and in fact, getting to know more about them than they perhaps want us to know. And I would like to say that the people I have worked with have been enormously helpful. And without their warm-heartedness and without welcoming me into their homes, I would never have been able to get anything like the kind of data that I have been able to collect in the short time that I've been working in an Armenian community. I have taken a course in Western Armenian, but I can't say that I can either read or speak it. I can eavesdrop from time to time. I once heard a mother-in-law tell her son-in-law to take out the cat. They probably thought I didn't know what they were saying. I've also taken a course in Armenian cooking. I was looking for a language course initially, and that was all I could find locally, and that turns out to have been perhaps the most important language that I could have learned. I'll begin with the paper, which is an attempt at accounting for the present structure of the Armenian family in the United States. But in order to make sense of the Armenian American family, it is necessary to reconstruct the Old World family of the late 19th and early 20th centuries to suggest how this particular family system has become modified over time. It should be stated that the single most influential factor in any understanding of the modernizing Armenian family is the series of disasters, economic, political, personal, which befell the Armenian people as a result of their persecution by Ottoman Turks, beginning at the end of the 19th century and culminating with the genocide of 1915. In the absence of these sorrowful events, perhaps the ancient Armenian social structure might have been preserved. Today, not a single vestige of Armenian village life remains in eastern Turkey. The changes which occurred in the organization of the Armenian family were in part direct responses to new situations in foreign lands, and in part accommodations to huge losses of population, especially of the older male generation. It is quite striking nonetheless that despite the deportations and loss of life, elements of traditional Armenian family life are still the most important ingredients in the preservation of an Armenian culture in North America. From informant accounts and published histories, it appears that the basic structure of the Armenian family follows the Western or European model described by the British anthropologist Jack Goody. The family which lives together under one roof is called andanic. It has been referred to as the nuclear family by Susie Hugassian Villa and Mary Matosian, authors of Armenian Village Life before 1914, but this seems to be incorrect. The andanic includes, besides mother, father, and children, father's parents, if both are living, and the children of any married sons. The andanic is patrilocal, meaning that at marriage the newlyweds live with the husband's parents, and patripotestal, referring to the fact that domestic authority is in the hands of men. The Kyrgyzstan is the most comprehensive Armenian kin group, which is composed of relatives from both the father's and mother's sides, including in its membership all the descendants, both male and female, of the 4 grandparents up through second cousins. It has been erroneously referred to as an exogamous patrilineal clan by Hugassian Villa and Matosian, who make the claim that the Kyrgyzstan is a patrilineal descent group, or clan in which relationships are traced through male lines only, and including all descendants from a common ancestor in the male line for 6 to 8 generations. The people I have spoken with, however, deny that the Kyrgyzstan singles out the male side of the family for recognition in this manner. Instead, a Kyrgyzstan appears to have been an egocentric or personal kindred composed of relatives from both sides of the family, but with a strong agnatic or paternal emphasis, apparent in 1, the rule of residence, which is almost invariably patrilocal, 2, in the use of the patronymic ending IAN, and in its variants IANTS, INTS, UNTS, and ENTS, common to Armenian surnames, and 3, in the godparent or Gunkahir relationship, also inherited through a line of males. It is conceivable that in ancient times another kind of Kyrgyzstan existed, which was patrilineally organized. At least Moses Kuranatzi's History of the Armenians mentions princely clans and refers to genealogies. It is likely, however, that with the demise of the Armenian aristocracy, this older form of the Kyrgyzstan became defunct. Perhaps it was never important for the bulk of the Armenian population, but functioned only for aristocratic land-holding units. If confusion continues today about the nature of the Armenian kindred, it is compounded by the fact that village, as well as domestic authority, has probably always been patriarchal. This means that the decision-making functions of the family were traditionally carried out by the elder male members of the group, who were known as the family patriarchs. It did not mean that the position of family patriarch was descended in the male line and inherited by his son. One of the hallmarks of traditional Armenian society was its segregation of the sexes. Women, whose lives were totally encompassed by family and household duties, were obedient and frequently subservient to their male kin. Although freer than Muslim women, Armenian daughters and wives were strictly controlled by male family members. Young girls between the ages of 12 and 16 were offered in marriage to men whom they did not know. Married out of their paternal homes at this tender age, they had to begin their adult lives as daughters-in-law in unfamiliar households. These marriages, which were monogamous and without recourse to divorce, were arranged by the parents of bride and groom, sometimes with the assistance of a go-between or a mishnort. After a series of visits and negotiations, during which the family of the groom paid bride wealth to the father of the bride, the wedding ceremony took place. At the conclusion of the nuptial period, which sometimes lasted a full week, the young bride was led into her husband's paternal household, and, to the great merriment of noisemakers stationed below the bedroom window, she underwent her test of virginity. If by the following morning the groom's family could not hang out the telltale bed linen as the proof required of their daughter-in-law's purity, then the bride, disgraced, was returned to her natal household. Her chances for marriage were shattered unless she left the village in which she had been known. As I understand, this rarely happened because girls had few opportunities for sexual encounters before marriage, and because the great importance attached to family honor made men the guarantors of the purity of their sisters and daughters. The low position of the Hars, or young daughters-in-law, in the Armenian household was one of servitude and silence. She was forbidden to speak to her parents-in-law or to any of her husband's male relatives. Her household chores and responsibilities included waiting hand and foot on her father and mother-in-law. She had to wash them and tuck them into bed at night, and to kiss their hands out of respect for them. She was in charge of doing the laundry and carrying water from the well. The treatment of women in Armenian society generally echoed the absence of value placed on the birth of female children. Whereas the birth of a male child was welcomed as a blessing, the birth of a female was considered to be a curse on the family. Perhaps it was the many hardships which women endured in their youth when they moved as strangers to their husbands' households that made it possible for the Armenian family to survive death and destruction in the 20th century. For it was largely the women who, surviving the disappearance and death of fathers, brothers, husbands, tried to keep the family together by going out to work in non-Armenian households and businesses. No doubt the years spent forging affective ties in stranger households and bearing children which would bind them to their husbands' families gave women the emotional and physical stamina necessary to start new lives in foreign lands. The period between the 1890s and 1920s was a period of transition for the Armenian family. The old rural familial pattern had broken down. With the decimation of the male population and the deportations, families were scattered. Children were sent to orphanages in Syria, Lebanon, and Greece, their whereabouts unknown to their next of kin. Eventually, many families were reunited in the ghettos of Aleppo and Beirut, in the rooming houses and tenements of Worcester and New York. But these were not the same families as the old world male-dominated structures. Instead, they were woman-headed, matrifocal units. Young children of both sexes and adults alike were forced to find work outside the home. At the same time, schooling became widely available for boys and girls through the auspices of charitable organizations and American Protestant churches in the Middle East. In the United States, Armenian children attended the public schools. In Ottoman Turkey, Armenian village girls had rarely been offered the opportunity to attend schools. Now they readily availed themselves of this new possibility, learning to read and write in English as well as in Arabic and Armenian. What was the outcome of so much book learning? Were its effects as disastrous for the patriarchal Armenian family as it was once supposed by heads of households under the old system? As it had been feared, young girls learning to write wrote love letters and received them from young men whom they sometimes met after school, but whom they did not always marry. The traditional system of matchmaking arranged by parents had given way to new courtship customs. It was no longer possible to arrange marriages between an Armenian youth now lacking in parental controls. Widowed mothers, less able to spend their time considering the marriage possibilities available to their offspring, had financial exigencies to worry about. In the end, sons and daughters had to find themselves lifelong companions through the good offices of age mates and pen pals. It was, after all, more than just an education to have learned to read and write, since correspondence often produced an Armenian spouse from overseas. Pen pal couples joined in holy matrimony, usually at the point of disembarkation of the bride, were no different from the girls and boys of the Armenian homeland, who married without having had the opportunity to get acquainted first. Surprisingly, to us, such marriages were long-lived, surviving the difficult years of immigrant adjustments. As Alfred Kazin once remarked about his Jewish immigrant parents who had met in an East Side boarding house, whatever affection might offhandedly be expressed between them always had the look of being committed to something deeper than mere love. I was perfectly sure that in my parents' minds, Liebe was something exotic and not wholly legitimate, reserved for educated people like the children, who were the sole end of their existence. What were the successful ingredients of such New World unions? How and why did they work out? It is quite possible that, as the initial expectations of the conjugal pair were in fact limited, they were in most instances fully satisfied, especially since romantic love was not usually part of the bargain. In its place, the age-old concept of family duty, Barda Gano Tune, served to preserve Armenian marriages. The family was the raison d'etre of Armenian immigrant life. In the remaining time, I would like to evaluate the continuing strength of traditional Armenian family values in America today. For in spite of the decline of the patriarchal family structure, many of the old world values have been retained. Indeed, much of Armenian life in the United States continues to be shaped by a set of shared cultural attributes which is still transmitted from generation to generation. The notion of the family remains central to the survival of Armenian traditions, providing the younger generation with a strong sense of continuity. At the same time, I should note that for some people at least, the experience of growing up Armenian in America carries with it a heavy historical burden. Such Armenians who choose not to marry within their culture express a desire to escape what they have perceived to be a confining family obligation, Vardagana, which stipulates that the next generation must follow in its footsteps by attending Armenian school, a Sunday school, and completing the circle by marrying Armenian. One can, after all, escape one's destiny by choosing someone else's. But for the Armenians who cherish their cultural traditions, outmarriage is not an appropriate response. Instead, children trying to abide by the wishes of their parents to marry a nice Armenian must not be caught in the company of Odar youth. Brides are, of course, no longer in their teens, but of legal age, and they may have known their spouses whom they met at church picnics, at the weddings of their friends, or through Armenian clubs at colleges and universities. Following the established American pattern of dating, such couples will marry, sometimes after a long courtship. Although contemporary Armenian wedding celebrations may no longer last for an entire week, vestiges of old world practices are still incorporated into such festivities. For example, the lockout, a practice whereby the bride is hidden somewhere in her house while the groom, his godfather, and brothers must search for her, is sometimes reenacted. Yet another prank played by the groom's family is the ritual stealing of objects from the bride's home. A photograph of her, perhaps some spoons, and even lingerie, all of which must later reappear in the hands of dancers on the groom's side at the wedding celebration. The nature of these traditional ritual practices is only poorly understood. Part of a folk culture no longer remembered, one can guess that the lockout and the stealing are holdovers from a time when an Armenian bride was genuinely reluctant to leave her kinfolk. It is possible that she had to be carried off or even captured by the groom and his party, who then held the wedding celebrations at his compound. The objects stolen from the bride's household appear to be symbolic of the various aspects of her marital role. Today, a typical part of the wedding service still includes a statement to the effect that the husband will be master, whereas the wife must be obedient. Clearly, the bride need no longer serve her husband's family, nor does she go to live with them after the wedding. In fact, in some cases, the groom may move in with the bride's family if they have a large enough house. Nevertheless, the modern bride is expected to be ready to receive both her father and mother-in-law in her home whenever they choose to visit her, although her own mother may not feel comfortable in visiting at her daughter's home without being invited to do so. But as one daughter-in-law explained to me, her husband's mother does not drop in because she lives too far away. The mother-in-law, for her part, would not expect to find anyone at home should she pay an unexpected call. Such are the demands of modern life. The significance of kinship ties and family relationships among Armenians today is best understood perhaps in terms of an attempt on the part of the communities in diaspora to remain loyal to a way of life that was neither abandoned nor willingly given up. I think that one clue to the tenacity of many Armenian families to folkways which are sometimes perceived as old-fashioned by contemporary American standards is the crucial fact that the Armenian people in many cases did not choose to leave their homeland. In fact, their history has been one of sporadic defenses against marauding tribes and predator nations whose goals had been their subjection or annihilation. Understanding the force of Armenian history, we can better understand the reluctance of Armenians to give up those distinctive features of their culture which permit them to remain as ethnic enclaves in contemporary society. Last night, Nathan Glazer made a telling point about the importance of ethnic identity for those groups which have had unsettled histories and for those with continuing troubles overseas. Glazer's notion of an ethnic group reluctant to cut itself off from the unsolved problems of the homeland helps explain the strength and perseverance of certain ethnic group loyalties in America at the present time. But whether in fact this recovered interest in Armenian ethnic identity is the result of renewed problems in the Middle East, or whether it is the result of a resurgence of national pride at a time when Armenians as a group have successfully made it into mainstream American society, are two views on the subject which need further consideration. Perhaps Armenian ethnic pride had not had to undergo a period of revival and rejuvenation, as Mr. Glazer has suggested, for the simple reason that for the Armenians it had never really elapsed. Although the bulk of Armenian immigration occurred before World War II, a fairly steady stream of immigrants have come to this country since then, first from Soviet Armenia and more recently from the troubled countries of the Middle East. This new blood has kept the Armenian communities alive and well. Non-Armenians have not yet realized the extent or the strength of these communities because they have been so busy stirring at the melting pot. It is now time to take a look at the Armenians in America. It is the moment of their own self-awareness, of their cultural maturity, a fact underlined by the very convening of this conference today.
Thank you very much. Our second speaker this afternoon is George Kooshian, Jr. of the University of California, Los Angeles, who's done graduate work in both history and linguistics, and appears from his CV to be a specialist in the teaching of English as a second language. His paper deals with church reform in America, the Diocesan Assembly of 1923.
Thank you, Professor Thernstrom. It's a pleasure to be here at Harvard and to see all these old buildings. I must tell you that in California we have buildings this old, but they're all made of adobe bricks. My topic today is a church assembly which took place in 1923. And you may wonder why I would want to tell you about that church assembly. If you lived in Southern California and saw the influx of new Armenians onto my own block where I've lived all my life, it would seem to you that you have seen everything before. And I'd like you to keep that in mind as you listen to this paper. The conditions of the Armenian church in the United States were considerably different to the conditions that they had been in the Old Country. And by the Old Country, specifically, we mean the Ottoman Empire, since most of the Armenians who came to the United States came from there. We identify the Armenian church with Armenian nationality in some way. If we go back into the ancient times, we'll find that the nationality and the church were identical. But over the centuries and over 2 millennia, the church's authority and domination over the society and its identification with Armenian nationality was challenged. There were 3 great challenges. The first challenge was the challenge of Catholic missionaries who came during the time of the Crusades and then particularly after the Reformation. The second challenge was the challenge of the Protestant missionaries. Their challenge was a little more fundamental because they challenged the very bases of the domination of the Armenian church over the nationality, because they challenged the apostolic succession, which gave the bishops the authority. They challenged the very essence of Armenian Christianity, which was the sacrifice of the Mass. And so they separated from the Armenian church and even were given their own separate government in the Ottoman Empire. The next challenge was the challenge of secularism and nationalism, which appeared among the Armenians at the end of the 19th century. And in the new revolutionary secular world, which the most extreme revolutionaries wanted to create, the church would not dominate the civil life anymore. So, in response to these challenges, the Armenian church had a movement of reform which started around the middle of the 19th century. And this first started with political reform, when the political organization of the Armenians in the Ottoman Empire was given a constitution. And it progressed from political reform to the question of celibacy of priests, to the question of marriage and divorce, to the question of church music, perhaps the abbreviation of long services, even the use of modern Armenian rather than classical Armenian, and even to union with the Church of England. All of these ideas were given out for discussion. They were opposed by those who saw the church as some kind of national museum, and also those who were conservative. All these proposals for reform presupposed a more fundamental question, which was the mission of the church itself. In one sense, there's no argument, because the mission of any church is the salvation of the people. But to do this, the Christian church over the centuries has asserted a temporal control over kings and emperors. It wasn't until the Reformation in Europe that this was broken, and then for the Armenians, however, who were always under the threat of foreign domination, whether from the Greeks or from the Persians or the Latins or the Mohammedans, the church became more of a national institution. The idea of salvation of the Armenian people as a nation, the idea of salvation of the Armenian people from Satan and the idea of the salvation of the Armenian people as a nation became inextricably mixed. And then with the exposure to Western influences, they became in conflict. This is a problem which we do not see in the Roman Catholic Church, which extends over different nations. But for the Armenian Church, the question of reform, particularly the reform of language, impinged on the national values of the church, which many Armenians put higher than its spiritual values. Was the Armenian church, the Christian church for the Armenians, or was it the national expression of the Armenians? After a century of cataclysmic events, defections, attacks, and conflicts with modern secular and anti-religious ideologies, the church was transplanted to America. Nothing was the same as it had been in the old country. Formerly established in civil and religious rule, she was now only one of many competing churches in a secular state. Furthermore, she was a foreign church facing the hot flames of the melting pot. This only strengthened her Armenian identity. Nothing had stripped her of her Armenianness. While she no longer encompassed the entire Armenian nation, she remained the only connection to the Armenian past. Her legitimacy could not be taken away. Even the Protestants acknowledged her primacy of honor, and the revolutionaries and conservatives both struggled to claim her for their own. Trial by fire and sword only added new national commemorations to her calendar. Once the fate of the Western Armenians had been sealed by the post-World War I settlement, the survival of the Armenians as an identifiable group once again was synonymous with the church's survival. Furthermore, in 1922, the American Congress enacted immigration restriction. This meant that henceforth there would not be any more Armenian immigrants coming into the United States to continually renew the church. The present and the future of the Armenian church and depended on the Armenians who lived in Armenia and on their children. All these facts were recognized by many Armenian Americans, and they proposed reforms. The question of reform, which had come up around the turn of the century in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, had been put off by the genocide. When the Armenian church came to America and started to recover from this terrible cataclysm, the questions of reform came up again. There was a great debate in the press over all of these questions, essentially the same ones which I enumerated earlier. There was one incident in London which was of a scandalous nature involving a priest, and this added more impetus to the movement for reform. Finally, the churches of California in 1923 wrote a letter to the primate, who was in Worcester, Massachusetts, asking him to convene a special meeting of clerical and lay representatives to consider all of these questions. The special meeting was not convened, but the questions of reform were put on the agenda of the next regular meeting of the diocese, which happened in October of 1923. The diocesan assembly convened with its representatives of the churches, both clerical and lay, and held its debates and passed its resolutions. Now, this assembly could only deal with administrative matters. However, they did take up some substantive reforms which, if they resolved on them, they would have to send them to the Catholicos in Echmiadzin and to the Supreme Spiritual Council for ratification. But nevertheless, they took some action in these areas. Now, there were 20 of these resolutions, which, because of the time, I will not go over individually. However, I would like to tell you what they were. One of them was the reform of the calendar, because the Armenian church at that time was using the Julian calendar, which was 13 days behind the Gregorian. And add that the Armenian celebration of Christmas on January 6th made the Armenians celebrate Christmas on January 19th, which seemed a little odd in the United States. And there were some who even wanted Christmas to be celebrated on December 25th. The new calendar was adopted, but we still celebrate Christmas on January 6th. There were several resolutions which dealt with abbreviation of ceremonies, such as burial, baptism, well, we should start with baptism, matrimony, burial, and the confession, which is very long. All of these were given to committees to shorten and then to report back with their results. There was a resolution on church membership, which had some political implications, which we won't go into today, but the reason for this is that by signing up as a member, then one could vote in the parish assemblies, and the political parties were contesting these elections. And so this resolution would have required some spiritual worthiness as a requirement for membership, and it involved some political considerations also. One very inflammatory issue was clerical celibacy. The assembly voted to abolish clerical celibacy, which it could not do, but it voted to do that anyway. Another very important topic was the preparation of clergy. The United States was being inundated with clergy from the genocide, but what was needed was clergy educated to meet the American conditions. And the assembly recognized this, and they said that we have to do this, we have to provide education for clergy, but I think the economic situation which was following immediately made it difficult to do anything in that line. Other resolutions dealt with weddings and with marriage. There were proposals to reform the resolutions dealing with weddings and with marriage actually reaffirmed the traditional teachings of the church and stated that one had to be married in the church. If one did not, that was a very grave sin and would excommunicate one. However, they did not take up the question of divorce, which is not surprising either, because divorce is prohibited on religious grounds in the same way as it is in the Catholic Church. Also, there were questions of what to do with unbaptized infants who died. And this again is a ticklish question that appears in other churches, and the Armenians resolved this by saying that parents should take their children to have them baptized so that the problem doesn't come up. They also discussed a new administrative organization for the churches in California which were so distant from Worcester, but they put that off also, mainly for economic grounds. But the most important issue which came up was the issue of language, and I'd like to stress this a little more because as a second-generation Armenian myself, I can see the effects of this one problem on my generation, and I see how it will happen in the next generation. In all of its ceremonies and rites, in all of its hymns and prayers, in all of its lections and readings, the Church used the classical language. the classical Armenian language. A graceful and beautiful tongue, the language of Saints Mesrob and Nerses Shnorhali, hoary with tradition and use. For the deacons, for the scholars, for the educated, nothing could ever compare to the sublimity of the ancient language or the incomparable expressions of devotion of the hymns of the church. But for the common people, even though they might have known long sections of the Mass from memory, or have placed the Lamentations of St. Gregory of Nareg across the threshold to keep out evil, the readings, it was unintelligible. Even the scripture lessons, the readings from the prophets, apostles, and the Holy Gospel, whose purpose in the early church had been the instruction of the people, were read in the same incomprehensible language. The Protestants, who were more interested in saving souls than in saving traditions, cut the Gordian knot by discarding classical Armenian altogether. In all of their services, they used the vernacular, whether it was modern Armenian, Turkish, or English. So the missionaries translated the Bible for the first time into the modern tongue and into Turkish with Armenian letters, and provided hymn books of their own songs with Armenian and Turkish words. These could be, and were, and still are, sung in two languages simultaneously. The Protestants had no objection to the vernacular, no matter what it was. But for the Apostolics, the question of language was vital. In any liturgical religion, the constant repetition of the same words tends to endow them with a sacredness, so that to tamper with them in any way can be considered a sacrilege. Thus, the language will be perpetuated long after people have ceased to speak or understand it. Any attempt to change it will be met with dogged opposition. If the Roman Catholic Church, which was so strong and secure, waited 2,000 years to abandon Latin for the vernacular, then what could be expected from the Armenians, who had just emerged from an attempt to wipe them out from the face of the earth? Was not the language of their ancient rites and rituals the guarantee of their existence as a people? And if the holy mysteries were to be celebrated in another language, then what should that language be? Should it be modern Western Armenian of the bulk of the Turkish Armenian refugees? Should it be the Armenian of Persia or of the Caucasus, or even the so-called workers' Armenian which the Soviet government was propagating? Perhaps it shouldn't be Armenian at all, but English in America, Spanish in South America, and French in France. Either it had to be the same old classical language, or it had to be all of the above. As for the young, the English-speaking children of the immigrants, perhaps they could learn enough Armenian in the Saturday schools to continue the tradition. The only resolution the Assembly made on the subject of language was to accept, quote, in principle, the reading of scripture lessons in modern Armenian during the Divine Liturgy. But this was nothing new at all. In Cilicia, in the preceding century, where many Armenians understood no Armenian and spoke only Turkish, the missionaries had made many converts by speaking to them in that language. After this, the Apostolic Church even began to allow translations into Turkish of the Gospel, and the Catholicos himself is reported even to have delivered sermons in Turkish. If the Assembly avoided the question of language, then what could be done? The problem did not end with the reading of the Gospel in modern Armenian or English, or the delivering of bilingual sermons. Through constant repetition, most of the people, excluding the American-born generation, of course, understood at least some parts of the Mass itself or had some idea of what was going on, if they did not understand every word. But what of all the other services of the Church? There were many variable hymns and prayers. The Jamer Kuchun, or that is the office, baptismal services, marriage and burial rituals, and special services throughout the year, such as Lenten devotions. Unless they were to recede out of daily life, they had to be understood. In America, this was a problem of enormous proportions which could only get worse. For the children, despite the high hopes their elders had whenever another Saturday Armenian school was started in some church hall, had not a prayer of learning even a minimal standard of modern Armenian, much less the classical Armenian of the church. So they would inevitably be drawn to English-speaking American churches. If nothing were done, the Armenian church in America would die. The minimum that was necessary, as one priest pointed out, was to put bilingual prayer books in the hands of the people, particularly the young. The Roman Catholic Church still celebrated its ceremonies in Latin all the way from China to South America, and these people couldn't speak Latin like seminarians. But the church provided them with missals and instructional books in their own languages, and made a tremendous effort to educate the young. There were already precedents for this in the Armenian church. A bilingual classical and modern Armenian prayer book was in use in Constantinople already. A bilingual Armenian English missal had been published in London, and in India a priest had translated the entire office into English along with a catechism of Christian instruction. All of the liturgical books, everything, had to be translated and disseminated if the young were to learn. As for this priest himself, who made this comment, the marvelous Armenian and English missal, which he published in Fresno in 1932 through the generosity of the family of the Mosesians, complete with the text of the Mass, hymns and occasional services, and the melodies of the Holy Eucharist, was an example of precisely what was necessary. What else was necessary, the Assembly considered in the next resolution, which dealt with Sunday schools. The Assembly recognized the critical need to provide for the religious education of the young, and so instructed a committee to draw up a suitable plan for Sunday schools and to present it for implementation. This matter assumed immense importance in America because in the old country all the instruction had been religious instruction in the village schools or parish schools. But in America, with the separation of church and state and the complete exclusion of religious instruction from the public schools, all the responsibility fell on the church and the family. So the church had to adopt the Western institution of the Sunday school. What textbooks there were had to be disseminated and new materials prepared. The Jamakirk, or Book of the Office, so necessary for personal devotions, had to be taught along with the Bible. Competent teachers had to be found, and the doctrines and practices of the church had to be taught. In short, the children had to be made into Christians. This was already a big enough task for any church, but again it was compounded by language. It offended some that any English at all was used in the church. The official language of the Armenian church was Armenian, they said. So even the instruction in the Sunday schools had to be in Armenian. How could a child who was taught the Bible in English ever hope to have a warm relationship with his mother church? On the other hand, it was pointed out that the American-born generation, which constituted the future of the church, was growing up with English. The old arguments over whether to use classical or modern Armenian were meaningless, because the day was swiftly approaching when no one would know either. The young people had already cooled off, objecting to the language. So the older generation put their hopes in the language schools which operated at the churches on weekdays after school and on Saturdays. But it was not understood what an effective school involved. They were underfunded, understaffed, and underattended, and professional methods and materials were unknown, despite the dedicated and even heroic efforts of the ladies who operated them. And most of the operators, as Professor Myrek pointed out in his book, were the women. One Fresno mother wrote to the paper in 1926, I wish to say that our children are denied the means of receiving religious and moral education in the spirit of our church and are gradually being lost. The American Armenian Church is sleeping, and its officials do not feel the gravity of the present danger. And we mothers see the daily foreignization of our lands and the bastardization of our national language and traditions, and we remain indifferent. We say, we can't help it. But talk has it that in the Fresno Armenian community alone, we spend nearly $30,000 for religious purposes, but barely $300 for Armenian language and national education. We also send $30,000 to orphans and refugees in Armenia and other countries, but we don't think of our own children right here before our eyes. Through our own acquiescence and indifference, they are becoming orphaned, which for us will be an accursed remembrance. So the great issue facing the assembly in 1923 was the survival of the church itself. Did the assembly understand it, and did it take effective measures to confront it? The fathers and lay representatives who attended the assembly showed by their resolutions that they were aware that the church was in a period of crisis and that action had to be taken. This they did by proposing reforms of the calendar, rituals, and music in order to make the church services more appropriate for life in America. They addressed the question of celibacy and encouraged the preparation of priests. They attempted to strengthen spiritual life by reaffirming the teachings of the church on baptism, marriage, and Holy Communion. They recognized that there was a language problem, and they tried to do something about the religious education of the young. Such discussions were essential, and the delegates had a right to feel satisfaction and enthusiasm at having held them. This satisfaction and enthusiasm was felt by the whole community, by conservatives and revolutionaries alike, as reflected in the comments and editorials which appeared in the press. But a reform movement, or a movement for renewal, cannot stop with one meeting. After the assembly, the delegates went home and the committees made their reports. If the reform movement was to have had a lasting effect, it would have had to have continued and grown. It would have had as its evidence the increase of church attendance, the increase of vocations and popular piety. As far as I can tell, this did not happen. Instead, the political divisions among the Armenians grew and involved the church more and more until they exploded into violence in 1933 and tore the church and the community asunder. The church was not able to calm the passions of partisanship and was itself rent by partisanship. The church had also to embrace her American-born children. That meant that she had to become self-sustaining. She could not depend on transfusions of new blood from abroad, because during the 40 years of immigration restriction, there were no transfusions from abroad. American-born Armenians themselves had to have vocations and become priests. The essential precondition for this was an increase in the level of religious devotion. This depended on the education of the young, independent of any consideration of language. The conditions of the American environment also conspired against the church. The government and popular opinion of the United States fostered a ferocious doctrine of Americanization, which had as its purpose the absorption and elimination of all the immigrant groups into the great American culture. This message was constantly hammered into the head of each public school child without the slightest bit of subtlety. It is no wonder that the Armenian language never gained a foothold among the American-born children of the Armenian immigrants. Beside this, the economic conditions precluded the kind of effort that was necessary. It was self-delusion to expect that the little church language schools could turn out functioning Armenian speakers. That would take a complete system of elementary and high schools offering Armenian as well as American education. Even if it were politically feasible, which it was not before the 1960s, where would the money come from? Even by 1923, some parts of the country, notably Fresno with its great Armenian community, were already experiencing the first economic contractions leading to the Great Depression. and the prelacy was complaining that it didn't have the money to conduct its own operations. If the Armenian Church and the Armenians as an identifiable group were to survive the long years of immigration restriction, Americanization, depression, and war, it would not be because of the Armenian school, but because of what Armenian parents taught their children in the home. I would like to add one postscript. One is struck by the similarities between 1923 and 1984, and the differences. The Armenians of America should take note of this. It is very rare in history to get a second chance. Thank you.
All right, we'll now adjourn very briefly, 5 minutes, and reconvene.
So much thought was put into the diocesan assembly that currently stays
Here is Aharonian of the Worcester Youth Guidance Center, whose background is in the field of social work, and who's just published a book I haven't seen, but that sounds tantalizing indeed, called Intermarriage and the American Armenian Community. And in his paper, he will provide us an overview of his findings, and I take it some second thoughts, afterthoughts about that very fundamental subject.
Thank you, Dr. Thernstrom. This paper on intermarriage will of necessity intertwine with issues of identity and assimilation, the two themes of this conference. Our conventional perception of intermarriage is that it is a marriage between two individuals of different ethnic, racial, and/or religious backgrounds. While this presentation will focus on this conventional definition, we must make note of the fact that there is a broader and a more comprehensive cultural conceptualization of intermarriage. This occurs when there is a blending, joining, or amalgamating together of different cultural values within an individual or group. For example, Armenian Americans and other ethnics are oftentimes referred to as being a bicultural people. Biculturalism, or possessing a dual culture, is a euphemism for cultural intermarriage. In this very important sense, we are all intermarried. If we are not intermarried in the conventional and strictest sense of the word, we are all intermarried in the cultural sense of the word. Then, of course, there are those who are intermarried both interculturally and interpersonally. Over the past few decades, major bicultural changes have occurred in the Armenian American lifestyle, so much so that Armenian Americans are not what they used to be. Armenian is no longer the main spoken language. Armenians are also not as cohesive, as warm, as loud, nor as informal as they used to be. Even the newcomer Armenians from abroad will say of the long-term resident Armenian Americans, quote, "You Armenian Americans are not real Armenians. You are different. You are only half Armenian." In Armenian they will say, "Tuk shidag haychek," or "Tuk miain ges hayek." Indeed, Armenian Americans are different. Different because they have intermarried with the dominant American culture and lifestyle, which is immediately noticed by the newly arrived immigrant compatriots from abroad. They can readily perceive the end results of decades of assimilation, almost as though the Armenian American wears it on his or her shirt sleeve. Assimilation, roughly defined, is an active, pervasive, and ongoing process of biological and sociocultural change, whereby there is a reciprocal but unequal interpenetration of values and absorption of people among two or more coexisting groups or cultures, one of which is dominant. With this definition, we can see that assimilation in America is not necessarily a one-way street or a one-way relationship, though it is definitely more one-way in favor of the dominant American culture. The Americanization of rice pilaf and Armenian bread, which can be found conveniently packaged and readily available on supermarket shelves, attest to the fact that cultural intermarriage is at least a two-way street in this sense. These are but tiny examples of what is meant when it is said that America has been enriched by the infusion of values from foreign cultures. Assimilation is a process of give and take. As we all know, the process of assimilation is indiscriminate, and it does not affect Armenians only. It is certainly choosy in some ways, but nonetheless it touches the life of every ethnic group and minority in America. As a part of the process of assimilation, intermarriage affects every religious denomination and all ethnic communities. Philip M. Kayal, in his 1981 article on Eastern Orthodox exogamy, written in St. Vladimir's Theological Quarterly, notes, quote, "Whether it be a racial, ethnic, class, and or religious intermarriage, it is both, that is, intermarriage is both a measurement of social distance between groups and a strong indicator of group cohesion. That is, the greater the number of mixed marriages, the weaker is the group's solidarity. While being proscribed by nearly all religious groups, intermarriage is a fact of American life and is felt to be the surest index of assimilation," end quote. From a number of parishes studied in Pennsylvania, New Jersey, and New York, Kayal reports that assimilation is running very strong among Eastern Orthodox Americans of Syrian, Greek, Russian, and Ukrainian descent. For the time frame of the late 60s to the late 70s, as adapted by me from Kayal, the following approximate cumulative intermarriage rates for these groups were as follows: Syrians 83%, Greek 64%, Ukrainian 79%, and Russian 84%. Catholic interfaith marriages are reported at about 40%. Protestant interfaith marriages are near or below 40%. The Jewish intermarriage rate ranges from 31 to 40%, with the Jewish Orthodox rate being the least among the Jews. But the least involved in intermarriage rates are black-white marriages. In 1977, there were a total of 125,000 black-white marriages in existence. This represents the total accumulation of such marriages through the years, and which were still in existence that year. We do not know the actual black-white intermarriage rate for 1977. Also, because of a lack of available statistics, we do not know the current national frequency of interracial black-white marriages. However, it is generally believed to be a fraction of 1%. Statistics involving these other groups were cited today to remind ourselves that intermarriage is indeed a widespread American phenomenon, and also to provide ourselves perspective and a basis for comparison with the Armenian intermarriage picture. Being involved professionally in child guidance in addition to marriage and family counseling, as well as to being a lifelong member of the Armenian Apostolic community, I realized for some time that there was a high intermarriage rate among Armenians which needed to be carefully studied and assessed. Not wanting simply to guess or to obtain estimates from the authorities as to the prevalence of Armenian intermarriage, I decided to document this phenomenon by evaluating the marriage registers in the various parishes under the jurisdiction of the Eastern Diocese of the Armenian Apostolic Church of North America. I further decided to delimit my study to the New England churches of the diocese, where I believe the elements that comprise the New England socio-cultural environment and which have a bearing on the rate of intermarriage have the relatively same socio-dynamic significance for Armenian Apostolic churches wherever else they may be located in the United States. I am convinced that the findings gathered with regard to the New England Apostolic churches will be corroborated more or less by similar high rates of intermarriage in the other regions of the diocese, as well as in the Western Diocese, except where there are large numbers of concentrations of new immigrants. Out of the 11 churches in New England belonging to the diocese, I obtained statistics from the following parishes for the 27-year period from 1950 to 1976 inclusive: Worcester, Lowell, Lawrence, Haverhill, Watertown, Cambridge, and Springfield, all in Massachusetts, Providence, Rhode Island, and Hartford, Connecticut. Findings. Examination of the statistics reveals that Armenian Americans are now experiencing a process of mass assimilation in the New England area. While these statistics are based on the New England Armenian Apostolic churches of the diocese, it should be borne in mind that these are among the oldest established Armenian communities in the entire Western Hemisphere, and it is quite likely that what is happening here foreshadows what will be happening in the younger communities as they themselves age and as they pass through the successive stages of social change and assimilation. It certainly is not an accident that the highest cumulative rate of intermarriage of 67% over the 27-year period studied is highest in the oldest Armenian Apostolic Church in the country, namely the Armenian Church of Our Savior in Worcester, Massachusetts, consecrated in 1891. Similarly, the second highest rate of intermarriage of 55% is in the St. Svajian Armenian Church of Chelmsford, which is the third oldest church studied, having been originally consecrated in 1916. The third highest rate of cumulative intermarriage of 50% is in the St. Sahag and St. Mesrov Armenian Apostolic Church in Providence. It was consecrated in 1914 and is the second oldest among these churches. Thus, of the 9 churches included in the study, the 3 oldest churches have the 3 highest rates of cumulative intermarriage. But that does not tell the whole story, since the annual rate was running at 100% during the latter years of the study for several of these churches. Another significant finding is that in 1976, the last year of the study, there were 62 marriages altogether that took place. That is less than 1/2 the marriages that occurred in 1950. One possible explanation for this sharp 120% decline could be that the large number of marriages listed for the base year of 1950 still represent part of the peak of the post-World War II high rates of marriage. Another possible explanation could be that a significant number of Armenians are departing from tradition and are getting married outside the Armenian Church. Other possible explanations could be represented by a declining birth rate or by migration by Armenian Americans away from the New England area. Another significant finding is that there was a dramatic 9-fold or 900% increase in mixed marriages. By 1976, 81%, or 50 out of the total 62 marriages for that year, were mixed marriages. Considering the fact that an unknown number of Armenians marry outside their churches each year, I would state with reasonable certainty that as of 1976, the annual percent of mixed marriages is closer to the 90 to 95% range. On good authority, the intermarriage rate is currently running at 100% in a number of the communities studied. What is not shown in these statistics is the commonly recognized fact that the overwhelming majority of mixed marriages that take place in the Armenian Church end up with these couples and their children not being affiliated with the Armenian Church. There are relatively very few such couples involved in our New England churches out of the approximately 900 couples who receive the sacrament of holy matrimony. Is the church as a community failing to do something it could do? The answer is at least triangular, and it is to be found perhaps in the conservative attitude of the clergy, in the attitude of the mixed married couple, and significantly in the attitude of the general Armenian community, which tends to be rather ethnocentrically parochial in its outlook, and which consciously or unconsciously discourages non-Armenian membership in the church. It is my general impression that these variables are all changing for the better and contributing to a more positive, welcoming climate toward the mixed married couples. Why such a large increase in Armenian intermarriage? A number of facts stand out very clearly that will help explain the dramatic increase in intermarriage, especially following the end of the Second World War. With their arrival in the United States, with their arrival in the United States in the late 19th century and early 20th century, the Armenians first established themselves together closely in certain neighborhoods in the big cities, where their close proximity to one another gave them a feeling of security, even though there were no genuine external threats to their physical survival as a minority community. Though there were a number of ugly, isolated incidents, there were no real organized efforts against them by the larger community. They established their churches and Armenian language schools in their neighborhoods. 2. Armenians soon discovered the full meaning of what it meant for American society being a pluralistic society, which allowed the freedom of development of the various cultures brought here by the different minority groups. Under the umbrella of cultural pluralism, the Armenians flourished in terms of their expansion outward and upward. Outward from their original ghettos into the large cities to the suburbs, and upward socioeconomically and culturally, from at first being unskilled laborers to later being primarily middle class, skilled workers and professionals, as well as a significant number of upper class and wealthy Armenians. In moving to the suburbs, a very significant number of Armenians created distant physical proximity among themselves in that process of social change that comprises an important stage in assimilation. Third, the Armenians in the United States are no longer as physically or as socially cohesive as they once were, even as recently as 20 years ago, except for the new concentrations resulting from the latest waves of immigrants. 4. With the decreasing cohesiveness, there has developed a broader, more cosmopolitan feeling of affinity to other American minority groups with whom they began to develop a common American identity. 5. The civil rights and black power movements of the 1960s had the effect of polarizing the various white ethnics into a higher level of self-consciousness and perceiving themselves as all belonging to a larger family. Among Armenians, as well as other white minorities, there developed a heightening of their awareness of one another as white, thus reducing the social and emotional distances among themselves and increasing their appeal and acceptability to one another as members of a larger white family. 6. Unlike their experience in Turkish-occupied Armenia, they found their Christian traditions generally compatible with the largely Christian society of America. In the 1960s, the spirit of ecumenism appeared on the Christian horizon. Ecumenism is another name for Christian cohesiveness and togetherness. The spirit of ecumenism in the modern world came about chiefly from the threat derived from a growing atheistic world communism. The ecumenical spirit perhaps has done more to accelerate intermarriage in the Armenian Church than perhaps any other single factor. 7. Another important development has been the increased secularization of American society. This in turn has facilitated the ecumenical spirit not only among Christians but also among Christians and Jews. 8. The Americanization of the clergy of the Armenian Apostolic Church has contributed immensely, along with the acceleration of bilingual church services and the construction of attractive new church edifices in the suburbs or in pleasant urban surroundings. With more clergy in full command of the English language, it has facilitated communication, and it has made it more inviting for the newly betrothed to bring their non-Armenian brides or grooms to be wed in the Armenian Apostolic Church. 9. Romantic love, which was largely forbidden or discouraged in the old country, except in Armenian love songs and romantic poetry, has been held out in America as the ideal motivation force for marriage. Since romantic love does not recognize ethnic boundaries, it is bound to involve Armenians in romance with their non-Armenian high school or college classmates, or at work, or in their neighborhoods, or wherever else they may meet the opposite sex. 10. The increasing acceptance of the idea of intermarriage by American society at large. 11. The small size of the Armenian American population, where approximately 1 in 450 Americans is of Armenian descent. It is axiomatic, it is a truism, that the smaller the population of any group within the larger population, the higher the incidence of intermarriage for that group. The Armenians, with their small numbers and high intermarriage rate, certainly bear testimony to this principle. 12. There are probably other major as well as lesser social mechanisms involved that contribute to the high intermarriage rate in America. 13. There are also many highly individual, psychological, emotional, and economic factors that interplay on the intermarriage scene. Many possible explanations could be offered from a psychoanalytic viewpoint, such as viewing intermarriage for some individuals as a reaction against too strong an emotional tie to either parent. For example, an Armenian male may at one and at the same time both idealize and resent his mother, and consciously or unconsciously seek out a mate who does not resemble her, thus being motivated to develop an affectional tie to a non-Armenian woman. Of course, the opposite might and does occur, where the Armenian male loves and idealizes his mother to the point where only another Armenian woman will qualify as his mate. Then there are those who are rebellious and prematurely independent in their strivings, who also might not feel fully accepted within the family, or feel slighted, or feel that a brother or sister is preferred, and so they might intermarry out of the ethnic group to be spiteful or in a search to gain acceptance by outsiders. Similarly, there are those Armenians of either sex who might have a feeling of inferiority about their Armenian ancestry, and who intermarry in an attempt to elevate their social status and improve their self-esteem. On the other side of the coin, non-Armenians marry Armenians for similar reasons. The psychodynamic reasons for intermarriage are limited only by the number of people involved. There are many theories and plausible explanations, but they all boil down to people searching for emotional, affectional, social, physical, and financial security. These apply, of course, whether it is in relationship to marriage or intermarriage. Some conclusions. Given the historical, socio-cultural environment that is America, with its multi-ethnic populations, alongside the evolutional changes already introduced within the social fabric of the Armenian apostolic communities in New England, it is highly improbable that the high rates of intermarriage will ever decrease in any significant or lasting way. There may be an occasional annual reversal to lower rates, but these will only be temporary deviations from the long-term permanent trend of persistently high intermarriage rates. For reasons that need to be carefully researched, the overwhelming majority of these mixed married couples do not affiliate with the Armenian Apostolic Church, notwithstanding the fact that they marry in that church. It is my impression that a significant number of the non-Armenian spouses convert to the church, but they do not become practicing members. They are nominal members only, and they are very weak in their identification with the church and with the community. However, there is an active, dedicated minority of mixed married couples and families in most, if not in all, the parishes studied. Their numbers are increasing, and the general membership of the church is welcoming them. The ice has been shattered by the fact that the majority of Armenian families themselves have been touched by the phenomenon of intermarriage. In fact, in the course of interviewing 5 non-Armenian spouses of mixed married couples active in the Armenian Apostolic Church, they all declared that they strongly identified themselves as Armenian, like the rest of the membership of the church. They viewed their entry into the Armenian church and community as a growth experience. By their examples, these couples are highlighting the endless possibilities for our involvement of other intermarried couples in the life of the church and the community. I call these non-Armenian spouses functional converts, who also exemplify the thought that assimilation is a two-way street. The Americanization of the Armenian Apostolic Church will proceed spontaneously with the changing composition of the membership of the church through intermarriage, which is now normative. As the body of the church becomes more polyethnic, as it is already beginning to become, some of the traditional characteristics of the Armenian church ethos will be put to a series of tests in its ongoing transition to American institutionalization. There is every reason to believe that with hard work and thoughtful planning, the church will pass its tests with flying colors and will maintain her historic loyalties and hierarchical ties to the central authority of the Armenian Church and Holy Echmiadzim. The Armenian Church in America, as the primary institution among Armenians next to the family, has herself taken on a bicultural identification, having culturally intermarried with the spirit of America. This can be appreciated from the fact that the number of Native American-born clergy is increasing, not fast enough certainly, but it is increasing. They are increasing in their numbers in the service of the church. There are a number of non-Armenians in important positions within the church. Moreover, the church has her own American seminary for the training of clergy in an American environment. There is an increasing number of intermarried couples joining the church. These developments are as scattered rays of sunshine, giving cause for optimism in believing the Armenian people and their ancient venerable church will transcend the negative elements of the American melting pot. It is in the nurturing of the best elements in the American melting pot, the positive elements in the American melting pot, together with the time-tested values of the old world as embodied in the Armenian Apostolic Church, that Armenian Americans will maintain healthy connections with their past and provide themselves with a solid sense of identity and direction for the present as well as the future. Finally, the interpersonal, cultural, and institutional levels of intermarriage of our people and church with the American ethos will endow the Armenian American community with the kinds of synthesis and organic harmony which should guarantee the continuity of our people and of our worthy institutions in this great land of unlimited opportunity, unlimited by our own sense of creativity and by the efficient management of our own potentials for growth and service to help meet the needs of our people. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Our final speaker is Professor Svajian, who has her PhD from Cornell in education, who has a long teaching career, much of it spent in the Middle East, in Beirut in particular, also in Aleppo. She has written widely on problems of infant development and cultural adolescent development, and has been extremely active in Armenian affairs, particularly Armenian school affairs, which is the topic of her presentation today, the Armenian school movement in America.
Thank you, Dr. Thernstrom. Recent observers of the Armenian American scene, in spite of all the assimilationist signals we've been getting, have been pointing to movements manifesting a cultural reawakening, albeit still fragmentary in nature and lacking strong organizational structure, perhaps. The Armenian day schools feature as a relatively recent development, barely 2 decades old. However, both the cultural consciousness and the Armenian day schools and the Armenian schools as bulwarks of Armenian identity have their roots in the beginning of the Armenian community in the United States. Thus we read in Robert Myrak, as foreign-born Armenians enrolled in the public schools and night schools, the Armenian community sought with considerable sacrifice to retain its cultural identity by establishing Armenian language schools and lyceums. Armenian schools were founded as soon as colonies formed in the New World, for parents feared that children would forget the ancestral language and become lost to the nation. The first Armenian language school started in New York in the late 1880s. By World War I, the schools as adjuncts of the Apostolic or Protestant churches appeared in every community in the United States. In addition to these Saturday afternoon schools, they had lyceums and libraries for adult education. The afternoon or Saturday Armenian schools founded in 1880s in the United States can be thus considered the precursors to our present-day Saturday Armenian schools, sponsored by the Armenian Church, Apostolic and Evangelical as well. These Saturday schools number more than 75 and have almost 4,600 students. Until 10 years ago, the pattern of staffing, commendable in its spirit of devotion in general, was sorely lacking in sound educational principles, particularly compatible with the student's environment. The schools lacked adequate instructional materials and adequate preparation of teachers. Remarkable improvement has been made during the last 10 years by the efforts of the Armenian Diocese. The establishment of the Armenian Language Lab and Resource Center in New York, in the diocesan compound, staffing it with a young, competent, imaginative, dynamic, and dedicated director, is a demonstration of the fruitfulness of proper planning. This is the 10th anniversary of the lab, but within a few years, this dynamic young director brought revolutionary change in quality. Educated in the Middle East, Europe, and in this country, she developed a series of Armenian language texts and instructional aids. She recruited staff that is mostly college degree holders. She secured funds for a yearly 2-week intensive teacher training seminar during the summers. Participants in the seminar obtained 6 college credits. In addition, she serves as an itinerant resource person to 40 parishes for on-site in-service training. She publishes a monthly paper for teenagers. These Saturday schools cater to children 3 to 16 years of age. The beginner's age was lowered recently on pedagogical grounds. Early beginnings in education has been the prevalent practice of schooling among Armenians, based on their needs as immigrants and their 19th century orientation to European educators, philosophers. The relatively recent emergence in the United States of Head Start projects, the current educational discourse on early beginnings, and the kindergarten movement in New York City of the current year bring credence to Armenian schools' practice here and the Middle East. Noteworthy among Saturday schools is also the Siamanto Academy in New York, which serves Armenian students of high school age and has succeeded in recruiting Armenian college professors for instruction. The academy was accredited at the beginning of 1983 by the American Council on Education to issue 3 college credits. In spite of reservations with regard to the lasting effects and in spite of hardships, the Saturday schools, which form part of the tradition of American society at large, will remain as part of Armenian efforts for cultural survival. For it is unrealistic to expect more than a small percentage of Armenian school children to frequent Armenian day schools. And it is fitting that this tie between the church and Saturday schools remain as a dynamic symbol of the beginnings of the Armenian school in our history in the 5th century, when Saint Mesrop Mashtots discovered the Armenian alphabet and freed the Armenian mind from foreign cultural domination, Greek and Syriac then. Papken Catholicos of Cilicia of recent years has said the Armenian church and the Armenian school lived side by side. In fact, it is more accurate to say that they lived by each other and for each other. In fact, in our concern with the Armenian school movement as an expression of the need and a vehicle for cultural survival, we must pay tribute to Sunday schools as well in the United States. While instruction in Sunday schools here has not been in Armenian, neither in the apostolic nor in the evangelical churches, their purpose is to nurture the religious heritage and as an important part of the Armenian culture. That program consists of church heroes and history, church rites and sacraments and the Bible. The first Sunday school started in Worcester in 1926, again by women, the Armenian Women's Apostolic Organization, and is still continuing under the auspices of the church. At the present time, we have 89 Sunday schools, 5,450 students, 3 to 16 or 18 years of age, some starting not at age 3, but with kindergarten age, and approximately 1,320 teachers. An interesting model in the evangelical churches is an Armenian heritage program to fill the absence of Saturday Armenian schools in their community. The Armenian Heritage Program is administered to 6 to 10-year-olds during Sunday service hours. It teaches Armenian culture and language. The Armenian Diocese has made significant strides in educational improvement in Sunday school instruction as well, through engagement of specialized staff. Considerable planning was carried for a series of new religious education texts now under preparation. The monthly bulletin of the Department of Religious Education tries to reach parents and children at home through sound educational methods, one finds there, that can engage the interest of and respect of the educated parents and their teenagers. It was natural for Armenian immigrants of the late 19th century, many of them having experienced oppression, persecution, and Hamidian massacres of their relatives, to seek means of perpetuating their language and other aspects of their heritage. The Saturday and Sunday schools were within their means, though requiring great sacrifice. They were also in line with the practice of other ethnic groups in this country. The Armenians who came to the United States experienced, it has been pointed out, like other groups, clear psychological and cultural conflicts. Assimilationist philosophies dominated the country and were attempting to tailor individuals and groups to a narrowly prescribed Anglo-American culture. The primary goal of the common school, the public school, says James Banks, and we know, all of us agree to that, like other publicly supported institutions, is to socialize individuals into the common culture. We read in Robert Myrick the quotation from William Saroyan, who entered the Emerson School in 1914 as a Fresno-born child of 1906. And I quote Saroyan. The immigrants are quickly made aware of a number of attitudes held by others about them, mainly that they are not the equal of Americans. First, there was a nickname for each group that amounted to an insult, not so much because of the nickname itself, but for the contempt with which it was frequently flung at a member of the group, not only by angered members of the group, but also by adults and teachers themselves. It was so bad that simply to refer to a boy by his nationality, as an Armenian, for instance, became the equivalent of an expression of contempt and, of course, an insult. It was soon so undesirable to be what you were that many boys and girls wished to God they were something else, and even tried to pretend that they were actually not Armenians, for instance, but Persian. Or they couldn't wait to get out of school and out of town so that they could forget what an unfortunate thing it was to be who they were. Bardasar Bahdegyan's story in the same source illustrates graphically the painful experience in another state. Bardasar Bahdegyan worked up to the registration desk of a Kansas City night school and struggled through an application. The teacher gleaned at the Armenian name and snapped, "Oh, give that up and change your name to Smith, Jones, or a name like that, and become Americanized. Give up everything you brought with you from the old country. You did not bring anything worthwhile anyway." Saroyan further remarks, if you were an Armenian in Fresno, this was an enormous fact about you, of special importance, and you had no choice but to carry the fact in one of two ways: proudly or even arrogantly, or shyly, if not secretly, and with embarrassment. Then he adds, I was not prepared to be belittled at the beginning of my life, and so it was necessary for me to meet contempt with contempt. Barbigyan similarly states, I was more an Armenian patriot than I had ever thought of being. Hostility works on identity to intensify or to weaken it. Many immigrants weakened and disguised their identity. It is difficult, however, to rule out psychological scars on those who resisted the weakening. There are always exceptions, of course. My late husband used to enjoy telling how in the early 20s he, as a young teenager, and his younger sister were greeted by the only Armenian student the first day in a public school arranged by the school staff. Cultural differences, however, are more subtle than language barriers. On this occasion, in this connection, he also liked to recount his first experience in the same school of taking a group IQ test. How many times I have used this with my students. As a newcomer, when he saw the multiple choice format on a test for the first time, he just couldn't think that this could be a serious undertaking. Checking, he said, and circling. Only when he finished the test quickly and as he was leaving the room, caught sight of the serious concentration of a room full of students, did he realize that there was something wrong. He was 2 days later called to the principal's office to learn that he had a substandard IQ. It took, however, less than 2 months for the school to elect him to Arista, their honor society. A couple of years later, as an older teenager, when his social needs to belong led him to hang out in Brooklyn with Irish and Polish adolescents, and his grades declined, his teacher called him and said, "Stephan, you came to this country armed with a love for knowledge and made rapid strides in school. Don't follow the boys in your neighborhood." Sensitive and perceptive educators at all times and everywhere meet their learners and remain with them. Unfortunately, they are rare at all times. For the most part, therefore, we breathe the aura of our times, the aura for developing persons as our children and youth becomes critical. The first generation of Armenian immigrants to this country suffered conflict similar to Eastern and Southern European immigrants and others, but they came with their unique history and heritage. Theirs was an ancient civilization, more than 3,000 years history, having established a golden age and translations and literary works, philosophical works as early as the 5th century. They had established universities matching in time with those in Europe, that of Echmiadzin, Haghpad, Sanahin, Klatsor. The latter followed the first university in Europe by a gap of less than a century. We commemorate its 700th anniversary this year. And most recent in their past, as immigrants in this country, their fathers, the grandfathers of that generation, had journeyed from the historic homeland, counted by subjects and in pursuit of university studies in Paris, Berlin, and other European cities, and created the remarkable cultural renaissance of the 19th century in Constantinople, and because these creators of the Renaissance were active intellectuals wedded to their people, The movement had spread to provinces, particularly through a strong network of excellent schools. An outstanding writer, orator, lawyer, politician, a member of Turkish parliament like Krikor Zohrab, deemed it importance to establish Gertasirat Smyuchun educational union, and women like Zohrab, Zabel Asadur, Serpuhü Disab were not only creative writers but dynamic workers, addressing themselves to problems of language and schooling. To what extent this cultural program perpetrated jealousy and contributed to the genocide remains a question. The truth is that the intellectuals disappeared from life in the most barbaric manner. The parents of the new generation of Armenians in the United States, therefore, were for the most part the peasant remnants of a culture-conscious people who bore the characteristics of a fine culture beneath an uncouth appearance. As this generation in the United States grew up, it gained maturity through continued psychological and moral nourishment from a staunch generation of family-centered, self-sacrificing, value-oriented parents. In time, their eyes were opened to the basic affinities between the fundamental values of the ancient culture of their parents and the fundamental values of this new world culture. This new generation came back to its community with new stature. While this result may be considered chiefly due to the basic affinity between the two cultures, we must not overlook the role played by the sprinkling of the educated leaders among the first immigrants that reached here, who created an attractive community life through Armenian publications, press, music, drama, art, educational organization, and substantial organizational life around the churches in particular. The activities of our educated leaders among the older generation, in addition to furnishing miniature and incomplete samples of our cultural heritage in this vivid manner, achieved two additional tasks in paving the way for the current cultural awakening and the need for schools. They sensed the gap between their way of life here and the ways of the old world. They bridged the gap by extending financial help to a generation of war-torn and massacre-torn immigrants in the Middle East, where educational opportunities depended on private efforts and where financial means were scanty. By extending this help, the Armenian Americans met important educational needs in the Middle East and at the same time gained a sense of purpose and identity. This role of our educational leaders, however, contained a dual character of both self-fulfillment and self-aberration. It was self-fulfillment to the extent that it unified the new world with the old in the form of ties with their needy compatriots. It was self-aberration to the extent that the heavy demands on their personal resources required that they forego establishing formal educational institutions of the kind that might have contributed to the growth of intellectual leaders here. Now, both generations sense that without formal Armenian education, cultural survival becomes seriously endangered. The Armenian Day School movement in the United States, fraught with what seemed to be unsurmountable difficulties and challenges, presents intriguing characteristics. The National Association for Armenian Studies and Research, close to its 35th year, features, in my thinking, as a godparent for the institutionalization of education. The establishment of an Armenian Studies chair at Harvard was followed by others in the East, Midwest, and West, counting now 5 endowed chairs. In addition, Armenian courses are being offered in some 25 different colleges. It is estimated that close to 20,000 students have benefited from these courses within the last 3 decades. As this kind of cultural ferments surfaced, leaders in the community, long concerned about future leadership in the cultural life of the community, realized that the establishment of Armenian schools could not be postponed anymore. The first Armenian school started in California in 1964. Within 20 years, 20 schools were founded. 6 schools were established in the 60s, 9 in the 70s, 4 since 1940, and 1 is scheduled to start in September 1984. The most interesting statistical information about these schools pertains to student demography. California schools report that on the average, 54% of the student population in the Armenian schools are from overseas. The range is 20 to 75%. Interesting variations appear. In the Watertown AGBU Elementary School, 85% of the parents are immigrants, about 90% of the students are American born. Of great significance is the fact that the waiting list of several of these schools rises to several hundred, up to 400. There is undoubtedly a pressing need for more Armenian schools, particularly in California. Can the Armenian community in the United States meet the challenge? Would the Armenian school become a movement without the influx of Armenians from the Middle East and other geographic areas? In spite of the fact that 4 or 5 of the 20 were established before the influx to meet manpower needs of the community outlined above. However, this question now is an academic one. The reality is that the pressing needs of immigrant families for adjustment to a new land and with a rich and successful background in Armenian schools in the Middle East, and the urgent needs of the Armenian American community for enlightened manpower meet the challenge. The challenge must be met. American Armenians, however, have at least 2 serious questions with regard to the Armenian schools. One is related to cost. In view of scarcity of resources, can the annual cost of $2,300 per student be justified? Proponents of the school movement point out that there is no choice. The schools are central to cultural survival. All other activities, important as they are, such as membership in organizations, youth cultures, and activities, are supplementary. American Armenians have also questioned the wisdom of segregating Armenian students from the common school, the public school, the mainstream. This point rings strong, perhaps especially for those whose education fell in an era of quality education in public schools, which has been eroded within recent years, unfortunately. A strong tradition of Armenian school curriculum has been multicultural emphasis. Since World War II, America has had to take a more sophisticated stance on monolingual, monocultural education as a preparation for citizenship and leadership in the world. Moreover, educators since 1960s have been vocal about their responsibility to translate political democracy into cultural democracy. They have moved from assimilationist to pluralistic to multi-ethnic education. Contemporary views on ethnicity and the schools range from those of Michael Novak, who believes that ethnicity should be an integral and salient part of the school curriculum, to those of Nathan Glazer, who cautions that too much emphasis on ethnicity in the schools might be inimical to the common culture and promote the balkanization of American society. However, both he and Mary Lucy Geramilo argued that for certain minorities, ethnic education makes sense, special minorities who have unresolved problems. It now seems more appropriate to talk about what really caused the process of ethnicization or ethnogenesis instead of acculturation and assimilation or Americanization if we are to understand the cultural diversity and ethnic dynamism of American society. Research has demonstrated that individuals are quite capable of maintaining intelligence both to their ethnic group and the nation state. Emerging social science research also indicates that individuals have a need for basic group identities even in highly modernized societies. In conclusion, I would like to point out the academic value of schools like the Armenian schools that foster bilingual, what I would prefer to call bicultural or multicultural education. The quotation is from the 1983 volume of Review of Research in Education, edited by Edmund Gordon of Yale, and the author of the article is also of Yale. Contrary to the findings of earlier studies, the results of Creel and Lambert study showed that bilingualism performed significantly better, that bilinguals performed significantly better than monolinguals in most of the cognitive tests and subtests, even when group differences in sex, age, and socioeconomic status were appropriately controlled. Bilingual children performed significantly higher than monolinguals on tests of both verbal and nonverbal abilities. The bilingual superiority in nonverbal tests was more clearly evident in those subtests that required mental manipulation and reorganization of visual stimuli. Time does not permit to give illustrations of my numerous contacts at various universities in the Middle East and the United States confirming this finding. Students from Armenian schools in the Middle East are usually unhappy in the United States colleges unless they attend the most demanding ones. They generally do very well and register rapid success in career and social life. And they come from school where selectivity in school population does not feature. I would like to end my presentation with two quotations, one from Edmund Burke. A people will not look forward to posterity who never look backward to their ancestors. And another one from Jose Ortega y Gasset. Nations are formed and kept alive by the fact that they have a program for tomorrow.
Thank you very much indeed. I will throw the floor open very shortly for questions and comments on these four, I think, extremely fascinating papers. First, I would say a word or two. I certainly won't be presumptuous enough to try to criticize any of these papers in detail, particularly before an audience like this, which contains a great many people who know far more about the Armenian experience than I do. But I did want to make one comment about the general context of American society and the role of Armenians and other groups in it. All of these papers deal to a greater or lesser degree with this general problem of group maintenance and ethnic survival in an extremely fluid and dynamic and free society. And I think you can see plainly from most of them that it's a very real problem. I would suppose most notably with these figures on intermarriage. And it does seem to me that academic thinking about ethnicity in recent years has rather obscured that problem. The conventional wisdom is no longer that the melting pot bubbled away. It's that, as Glaser said 20 years ago, the point about the melting pot is that it never happened. Now, that was in a book about New York City. It's a great book, but I don't think it demonstrated it for New York City, and I also don't think New York City is the United States. And I think we might get a better handle on what we're dealing with, what the problem of Armenians or Italians or others concerned for group survival really are in this society by going outside it for a moment and looking at another society, which is multi-ethnic. And it happens that I recently, for quite unrelated reasons, have been doing some preliminary reading on ethnic processes in the Soviet Union, which I have found extremely interesting and which is, I think, particularly pertinent for this audience because, after all, the bulk of Armenians in the world lived in the USSR. And I recall being quite fascinated at a brief passage in Robert Myrach's fine entry on the Armenians in the Harvard Ethnic Encyclopedia, which recounts the tale of the effort on the part of the Soviet government to recruit Armenians from outside the USSR to come to Armenia after World War II to help rebuild it. And a few hundred Americans were among them, 170 or so in the first boatload, and then several dozen more came. And at the time I read that, I'd never heard of it before, I thought they were really out of their minds. And what were they doing? Now, on reflection, I still think they were deluded, and of course, most of them concluded that themselves and tried desperately to get out, and most of them eventually did after endless trouble, but I understand that a little better in the sense that if you place your highest premium on being an Armenian, first and foremost, the Soviet Union is a better place to live than the United States. Now, it is a police state, it has a lower standard of living, I detest it in all sorts of ways, but it is an ethnically organized, segmented society in which ethnic groups have a corporate identity which has been denied ethnic groups in this country, except for those ethnic groups who have wanted it. Blacks, Orientals, until fairly recently. Indians is more ambiguous. They've had a separate identity recognized as nations. But the differences between the United States and the Soviet Union, I think, are very instructive for any of us thinking about this general problem of ethnic survival and patterns of assimilation. Now, the Soviet Union is not a better place to be Armenian because it's so wonderfully tolerant and loving of diversity. I think a good deal of cynicism about those claims in Soviet propaganda is entirely appropriate. It's an ethnically pluralistic society because it has to be, because that government would dearly love to wipe out Armenian identity and Georgian identity and Ukrainian identity and Estonian identity, but they can't. Those identities pre-existed the formation of the Russian and then the Soviet Empire, and they are very intractable. It's not an immigrant society, it is an empire which embraced and overtook and annexed various nations. Now that has a number of quite interesting implications. First of all, most ethnic groups in the Soviet Union have a homeland, like Armenia. Now maybe, Watertown and Fresno are homelands, but it's really different. Secondly, everyone in the Soviet Union has an ethnic identity. There are no plain Soviets, as there are plain Americans. You are citizens of the USSR, but on your internal passport, which everyone must possess, you are a Russian or a Ukrainian or an Armenian or any one of more than 100 other recognized nationalities, and you don't have any choice about which one. It is ascribed. It depends upon your blood. The only people who have a choice are the products of mixed marriages, and I'll come back to that. There's an interesting difference there. Children of mixed marriages at the age of 16 can pick one identity or the other, but they can't pick some other identity. It's got to be their father's identity or their mother's. Now, though the fact that you have this kind of fixity of ethnic status is profoundly important, I'll just point out two areas in which it makes for an enormously important contrast with the American scene. One involves the perpetuation of mother tongues other than that of the dominant group. You know, English in the United States, Russian in the Soviet Union. Now, the Soviets have been trying very hard to get everybody to learn Russian. And they have been, you know, broadly, they've been doing pretty well in that. I have interesting figures for Armenia specifically. Among Armenians living in Armenia, in the Armenian USSR, over the age of 60, only 15% know Russian. Of those aged 20 to 29, 48% do. There's a massive educational campaign, and they are indeed broadening the command of Russian on the part of the non-Russian peoples. Now, there's a radical contrast with the United States, though. Now, the interesting thing about the United States is not that, you know, all the Armenians learned English and the Swedes and so on. That was very functional. You needed it at work and so on. The very interesting thing about the United States was that the command of a non-English mother tongue in the home, in the family, was not passed on over the generations. The children of immigrants classically learned Armenian at home. They learned English at school. As young adults, they could command both. They were bilingual. However, at the crucial point of family formation, when they begin to rear their own children, in the large majority of cases, they reared their children in English. And thus, by the third generation, you have a tremendously rapid fall-off in the number of people who can speak a language other than English. And that's very monotonous and boring and culturally deplorable in certain ways, but it also has been a very important source of our common cultural strength and unity. And I would disagree a bit with the comment that this was mainly the result of ferocious pressure to Americanize. And I certainly would not agree with the notion that, well, it's these oppressive Yankees who want to stamp out Armenian. I would say American public policy has been, with some exceptions, as in the era right around World War I, really quite neutral and tolerant about the use of foreign languages. Much of the pressure came from the greenhorns, you know, the previous immigrants who've just become a little secure in their American identity and who want to take it out on William Saroyan or whoever else and say, ha-ha, you're not a real American. The Yankees cared much less in a way than the Italians and the Poles did. And I would stress the main point is that that loss of the non-English mother tongue was largely because people sensed the tremendous opportunities available in America for people who could speak English with the utmost fluency without a trace of a foreign accent. Finally, a comment, intermarriage. I agree with the paper that this is absolutely central to the ethnic problem, and I found the figures fascinating. I do follow the intermarriage literature, but I hadn't seen any figures in Armenians before. I expected them to be very high. I'm a little overwhelmed. They're quite that high. Now, they're the Soviet figures. I've recently read a paper on this, are very interestingly different. One, they're much, much lower, you know, an Armenian intermarriage rate of less than 5%. But secondly, and in a way more interestingly, what intermarriage means in a country like the Soviet Union is so terribly different, because everyone has only two parents. Suppose you are the product of, say, a half Armenian father who has Armenian stamped on his passport, and a half Russian, half Ukrainian mother who has Ukrainian stamped on her passport. You may well opt Armenian or you will opt Ukrainian, but you always have only two choices. Intermarriage has proceeded in this society so greatly that there are people who are 1/4 or 1/8 Armenian, 1/8 Japanese, 1/4 Scotch-Irish, etc. Now, I don't take the simple view, well, that's the end of ethnic groups, that once people have a complicated biological heritage, then forget it, because clearly you can identify with one tiny part of your heritage and find that rich and engaging and be as passionately committed to that identity as someone who has nothing but Armenian or Ukrainian blood. But clearly, it is a major problem for ethnic groups, and it certainly is a problem for those ethnic groups where there is a kind of tradition-bound clergy which is inclined to think in terms of, bloodlines. Fascinating debate now in the Jewish community as to whether or not Jewish identity can be allowed to pass not just through the maternal line, as has been the tradition forever, but whether the product of a Jewish father and a non-Jewish mother can be accepted fully, in some Orthodox groups say, no, you've got to have a Jewish mother. Well, that's talk more than I intended to. Now let me throw open the floor for questions. Yes, back there.
Just as an opening remark, and I probably will speak again since I'm starting to speak now, it seems to me that what I resent is some of the comments that have been made, and what I suspect a lot of Armenians and other so-called minority ethnic groups present, is the sense that either the Soviet Union or the United States has any really valid human solution, answers, or way of life for minorities. And I don't like to have one system that is bad pitted against another system that is bad. There are other examples of multi-ethnic nations that function perfectly well. Thank you. For instance, Switzerland. There are startling numbers of nations that are monolithic from the point of view, I think, of the perception of the outside, but certainly not at all from the perception of the inside. And some of these nations are now confronted with the task of resurrecting ethnic groups, or at least linguistic groups within a nation that have almost disappeared. France being a classical example, with the Bretons in the north and the Languedoc, the Occitanians in the south. It would seem to me that there is fundamentally something wrong with a society like the United States of America, that though you suggest it was not furiously for assimilation, nevertheless, did not take very dramatic or active steps to try to curb it. I dare say botanists and ornithologists and people interested in animal species spend more time and effort protecting what we have called, and what we all know as protected species, including insects, than they do in efforts to try to protect ethnic groups or subdivisions of ethnic groups that maintain and preserve and have preserved a humanistic line of language and culture that is on the verge of extinction, if not transformation to a point where it is no longer recognizable. And I think all of us appreciate the enormous lesson that we've learned in this country, even Armenian ethnics who are not here at the time it took place, but who certainly should accept full guilt for it, the elimination of entire Indian nations which no longer exist. The idea that the policy of assimilation provides some sort of benefit to its human being suggests that there is a beneficial policy in being that. But I don't see any particular beneficial thought behind the concept of assimilation, and I guess I will not see it until the country has made a dramatic move to make sure that those groups that it's kept out of assimilating begin to be included, namely blacks, Indians, and colored people of more distinctive colors. So I would suggest that by default of not having a more positive policy, a policy that would substitute for assimilation the fine word that Europeans use, integration, where a person can be totally and beautifully integrated in this culture and yet preserve and be integrated in another culture, is certainly preferable to any concept of assimilation, and what I think the word has, all the pejoratively that it has behind it, so I throw that out.
Well, I'd like to get our panelists in on this, but I can't resist a couple of words, which is to say, I would emphatically disagree. I think there are extremely few societies around the world which are genuinely multi-ethnic and democratic that hold together, and that Switzerland is an extraordinarily special case whose stability is dependent upon the happy accident of two things. One, an approximate demographic balance between the national elements, and secondly, religious cleavages which cross-cut them. You know, instead of giving me Switzerland, give me Belgium, or give me Canada, or give me India. I mean, more people around the world have been killed over ethnic conflict since World War II than any other question whatsoever. And I think there is something, you know, if you look at the history of American immigrant groups and the history of Europe, and you really think we can have a happily cooperative society in which the Armenians live next door to the Turks, and the Croats to the Serbs, and the Ukrainians to the Jews. I mean, if you think of all of the hatreds built into ethnic and national passions that, you know, blew up the whole of Europe in World War I, blew up the Austro-Hungarian Empire, I think you have to at least to concede. You bring all these people together in one country, give them all the vote within 5 years, you really want to create some common symbols, and you want to work very hard to say, look, you got to forget a little bit about, you know, how Croats felt about Serbs and vice versa, because you're Americans now. I mean, I think this place would blow apart, frankly, and I think a lot of societies around the world are close to that now. So I think the notion of every group, let 100 flowers bloom, yes, but within limits. And I do think it's very common now, for example, I've been talking a lot to high school teachers about the teaching of ethnicity, and there's a common line which is, it's so awful that we say our pilgrim forefathers and George Washington, the father of our country, when, you know, these little black kids and Mexican kids, and for that matter, almost all of us. I mean, half of the students in my typical Harvard survey class came to the United States after the Civil War, including all of my relatives. So what is our connection? Well, our connection with that is a symbolic one, and it's a very important one. It's a connection to a tradition that's of religious liberty. Oh, it didn't start as very much religious liberty, of a constitution building, a tradition of republicanism. And in those senses, even though I want to tell all the students, you know, George Washington was a slave owner too, George Washington was sort of the builder of a common nation, and we have a common heritage, even though our own biology attaches itself to that history, you know, rather late in the day. But how about some of the rest of you responding to this? Anyone care to?
I would like to ask Ms. Aharonian, are there any studies to show a comparison between the rate of assimilation of Armenians in America and the rate in other countries like France or England or Canada or Germany or South Africa?
If there are, I'm not aware of them, which does not mean that there aren't any.
Do you think it would be the same as it is in the United States, or not as bad?
I honestly don't know, so I can't answer your question. I cannot give you an informed answer, but my own guess is that assimilation is proceeding in all Western societies where there are Armenians settled, because of the general freedom and the general pluralism, cultural pluralism that obtains in all Western societies. So that my educated guess would be that you do have what I would call increasing rates of assimilation. And I personally do not view, having come as far as I have in life, I do not view assimilation as a dirty word. And as I try to emphasize, it is a two-way street. We have given up but we have also taken in. It's a trade-off. And I think if you can look at it positively, and for the life of me, I can't see the value of being negativistic about it, because you have to adjust to the realities of life and not to how you would like life to be. Yes, we all like to dream about how we would like life to be, and within reason we strive to improve our conditions. But on the other hand, we have to be aware of the big picture. And the big picture is that insofar as Armenians go, we are a tiny, tiny minority. And any of those who think that you can reverse the process of intermarriage and reverse the process of, and I don't view intermarriage necessarily negativistically either, as a part of the big picture of assimilation. But I think we need to view our relative inferiority numerically in the larger American society, and the overwhelming forces that are continuously impinging upon us are so profound, and they are so, I might say, relatively speaking, invincible, that I think we need to accept the reality of what is happening around us. I try to present you with facts, the facts of the rates of intermarriage. I also offered you some personal opinions. And my opinion is that we need to accept the reality of what is happening and go on from there, and not attempt to distort what is happening, which would cripple us from actually more efficiently making more creative use of our own inner resources as a community in this country, because we have tremendous potentials. There are tremendous potentials out there in the larger society too. For anyone who wants to get out there and take those potentials and make them of himself, to internalize them, to integrate themselves into their own community, as well as into his own or her own personality. We have all, as I attempted to stress, we are all intermarried. And try to reverse that. Try to change it. And I don't believe there's any such thing as a pure culture, unless you live on an island somewhere and have been on that island for a long period of time. I think that even in Switzerland, the Armenians are being assimilated. Speaking of the, I don't know what word the gentleman would have used, egalitarian society or what, I don't know. But even in Switzerland, I dare say, and I've never been there, but just recognizing the human condition for what it is, people like to borrow from one another. They look at one another and they see their attitudes and their ways of behaving, their etiquette, their values, and if their values are better than yours, you are going to borrow them. If you don't borrow them, you are going to deprive yourself of a very positive strength in your own personal situation. People cannot be expected not to take that which they feel is better for them. I know I take what I feel is better for me. I haven't always succeeded in getting it, but nonetheless, I've attempted to make and to enrich myself by what other values I see in the larger American society. And I see absolutely nothing morally, ethnically, or otherwise wrong with that kind of an attitude. That's going to change my character as an Armenian, but I hope it will improve my character as an Armenian.
I add just a sentence on that. I think this would be a great subject for another NAASR conference. The Armenian diaspora, comparative studies of Armenian communities, maybe just focusing on the immigrant receiving ones, Australia, Canada, Brazil, Argentina, or maybe globally, including the Middle East, the Soviet Union, places that were part of the homeland. But I think it would be fascinating. Yes?
Given the fact that the United States has such leadership in that the decisions that are made here affect people all over the world, and the fact that assimilation can lead to a kind of ethnocentrism that will make you study Western culture as superior, and perhaps are we forgetting that maybe the different groups, cultural groups that are here, might not be a wonderful way to help us learn about cultures that have been neglected, Asia, African cultures. We really, in our schools, don't teach these at all. They weren't taught, they were hardly taught when I was a child, and I don't think they're taught much anymore now. I'm wondering if cultural studies couldn't be a way for a global view that would help us consider people in the rest of the world as human beings. I think that we have not looked at the fact that there is so much denigration of certain peoples, not only in the United States, but also in other parts of the world, that we really have to do something about educating ourselves for a global view and learning about people as human beings, as equal human beings.
May I respond to that? I'm glad that point was brought out because I think that's where the role of small minorities in the United States comes as citizens of this country. Because it's good to say, and it is true, that there is tolerance in this country. And that's why assimilation is a phenomenon, both positive and negative, depending on what you use, on how you view it. And for some, it is a positive thing. And we have stressed so far that for certain minorities who have unresolved problems, the stance should be, yes, to benefit from this rich assimilatory experience, but not to forget what has not yet happened for them as a group. And I will give one illustration. It is our responsibility to really make our history known. The history of the Middle East, the history of Asia, the history of Africa, and it takes courage. It takes courage on the part of adults, and particularly on the part of school children. I have been very intimately related through the last 20 years, but particularly for 9 years as administrator of secondary schools in a city university. Our division was known, our department was known for the intimate relationship we created between college and secondary schools, so I know what I'm talking about. And I will give you only one illustration to illustrate both sides, what it takes from both sides. I gave the positive illustration of the experience of my husband. But just this year, 1984, my niece from Lebanon, I'm going to be personal, came to study here. Actually, she didn't come to study here. She came and couldn't go back. So she's in a secondary school in New York, in one of the inner city secondary schools. It's a good school. I'll give you the illustration of its goodness. When she says that she speaks 4 languages, well, they're impressed. And I don't consider the good part of the school because it does indicate an ignorance on the part of, and I consider myself American, Armenian, Armenian-American. It indicates an ignorance on the part of us as educators. We think that if a person speaks 4 languages, he must be a genius. Well, you don't need to be a genius to speak 4 languages. The teachers in that school take her as that. Now, it just happens that she is also a serious student and worked hard, and even though she wasn't prepared, in spite of all the 4 languages, she wasn't coming from an American-oriented curriculum, which we have in Lebanon in many schools. She was coming from an Armenian school that is mainly Armenian and French, and English was her weaker language. In the first semester, she was able to make grades so that every single course teacher gave her an honor certificate. The time came for her to have her credits abroad evaluated. So they had to look at the curriculum she had followed. History in Armenian, geography in Arabic, something else in French. So the teacher looks at it and says, Armenian? What's that? We don't use Armenian here. Sure we don't. But as an educator, if I were that person, I should have known that I'm an ignorant person, that an Armenian is a 3,000-year-old language and are not going to go into the virtues of the richness of the language. I would at least say, oh, Armenian, I don't know anything about it. Then the next remark, Arabic? Do you speak Arabic? You know, as if, why, how can you bring yourself down to speaking Arabic? That girl now is not armed to really make her defense. She's a strong girl, but she cried. And when she told me, I said, Colleen, you finish your school. This is a good school. They're giving you positive experiences. When the year is over, I will have a conference with the administration of the group. It takes this kind of fighting in a democratic society on the part of every citizen to feel responsible, to detect what is missing, and bring this two-way assimilatory phenomenon into a reality. It takes a lot of courage, and that's why I consider this kind of conference an education along those lines as well.
Yes. I've been impressed by these inspirational comments, quite sincerely. I want to ask a question of particularly the three of you who dealt with social history and with the family, based on a comment that Oscar Hamlin made last night about intermarriage, when the talk was about there's been so much intermarriage, and then we conclude from that that because of that the ethnic groups disappear. He said at the conclusion of the meeting, maybe not. That one of the things that had surprised him was that when people intermarried, to become, as it were, to meld things and adopt an American identity, that they don't seem to, because they can't find much of real sort of deep emotional satisfaction in becoming American, because America doesn't have those central symbols and rights or enough to satisfy. That somehow when it comes to things like when people get married, when they baptize children, particularly raising families, that somehow they rely not on an American ethic, because there isn't an American ethic on these things, but they rely on something closer, and what seems to be closest to them is their ethnic background. And I wondered if I could ask those of you on the panel who have been dealing with families and Armenian families, or families in general, whether you see, whether say second generation Armenian American families or third generation, bring the children up or behave as Armenians, even though we are sort of Americans who speak English, we don't have a language. Is this true, that the fabric is still there?
I'll try to answer that. I see it as a generational problem. I think now when people are getting married, and even if they're marrying other Armenians, that they tend to want to be more like everyone else, perhaps to be less Armenian. But then there comes a point when the children have grown up and they have grandchildren, or they even have the leisure time to reflect on their ethnic identities, that this is when there's a return to trying to revive old customs. I found in the course in Armenian cooking that I took that most of the other people in there were older Armenians. I was surprised. I didn't expect to find that. There were people who were returning to their roots, who were wanting to go back, and who had the time to really do just that. So I see it as a transitional moment. At first, when you're married and you're working and you're concerned with the children's education, maybe you don't have the time to think about training them as Armenians. But then later on, you regret what you haven't done, and you try and instill it at a later moment.
Yes. It appears that we are faced with a problem of definitions. And I want to say just a word with regard to the problem of intermarriage and education. Incidentally, very fine and insightful papers. But let me first quote Mayor Wagner of New York some years back, which I saw in the New York Times at the time, many years ago. America is not a melting pot, he said. America is a pressure cooker with departments. We put meat, peas, potatoes in different departments. We all cook together, but separately. We cook separately. We keep our own identity, but we all cook as Americans. I think that's a very beautiful picture. And there is a misconception or problem of definition in mixing what is American culture and what is, I don't like the word ethnic, ethnic culture. It's mixing oranges and apples. Because there is, first of all, a general, universal cultural atmosphere in this country. And then there are these, what sometimes are called subcultures, which are subordinate to the other culture, but are needed by special groups. Now I want to go to the other problem, the main problem. Of course, the question of intermarriage, which Mr. Aharonian discussed, is extremely important. The most important, if you ask me, problem. Not only we face, but also the other communities face. Yesterday, some gentleman on that row over there raised the problem, assimilation into what? Nobody answered that question. That is the most important question to be answered. Now, the word assimilation has two dimensions. First of all, the United Nations was a melting pot. So in 100 years, what kind of United Nations we are projecting into the future? Can we describe the kind of society which will emerge if there is this melting pot and assimilation, ineluctable assimilation? Now this has to be defined. What kind of society are we expecting, assuming that the kind of assimilation we are talking about will come about? Secondly, the assimilation has another dimension, and that is assimilation of one group into another group. It appears that most people think of assimilation as if we are in a society which is going toward a homogenation. Now, homogenation is against universal natural law. Galaxies and stars and animals and fish and insects, they all proceed in life and they are against homogenation. And societies are living beings. They are organisms with their own soul, if I may say so, but this problem is a big problem, whether organized societies have their own soul. If we compare it with the human soul, we'll see that there is a tremendous amount of similarities between my body and my soul and the social body and its soul. But let's leave that problem aside. Now, the problem assimilation. There is no prospect of homogenation. There has not been such a process in the world, in the human history. We always want specialization, and Darwin made that perfectly clear, not only for animals, but it's the same thing applies also for human society. We don't like homogenation, because we don't, our relationship are not sufficient to spread in this huge cauldron of soup where people are just peas. That is probably the image in the minds of those who are thinking of assimilation. But such a thing will not happen. We want a specialization. There comes the problem of the relationship of the past and of the future, to which a reference was made. What is tradition, which has constantly to change, and how can you change tradition if tradition belongs to the past and it's frozen? Because what is historical is frozen. How you can think of a living tradition These are problems of definition we have got to be absolutely clear about. Now, if the American society is not going toward a universal homogenization, therefore, what kind of relationship the cultural communal? That's why I don't think the term ethnic is a viable term. The term ethnic in time will disappear, but the communities will remain, and different kinds of communities in American society. There are, of course, all kinds of levels on which these communities form. On commercial level, on educational level, on economic level, classes, on geographical level, all kinds of levels. But there is another level, which is a very important level, and that is what has passed. These communities form on the basis of what their experiences has been in the past, just as individuals do. All individuals' progress is directed by what has happened to that individual in the past. There is an internal urge to change, and there is external environmental urge to change, and these two changes, these two urges, internal urges to change, to adapt, and external urges to modify these conflicting forces in nature, and this accommodation between what has passed and what has to come in the future creates these communities, and they go along. Therefore, if there is value in what has passed in my past as a person, if there is value in the general sense, that's another problem of definition. Why should we keep our community? Let's first decide that problem. Why should different ethnic groups make such an effort, spend such time to keep their ethnicity, their communal or ethnic identity? Why should we do it? This is a philosophical problem. It has to be determined. If you ask me, I'll tell you. All fish has the central urge of their life to perpetuate their species. All animals, even a piece of rock, has the determination to keep itself so long as there is nothing else from outside to crush it. It's called inertia. Anyway, so if I find myself in this society as a useful group within the general comprehensive lifestyle of the United States, if I find my own communal existence based on my past and my tradition as some useful component of this society, and when I am accepted as being a useful component of this society, then my communal existence will be assured. And look at our life. Why haven't, for example, the Jews have disappeared entirely? Why haven't the Roman Catholics disappeared? Why haven't the Lutherans have disappeared? Why all the other kinds of communities and groups, social groups, tremendous variety of social groups, not only geographically speaking, financially speaking, educationally speaking, but also there are those relationships which are not from 9 to 5, but after 5 o'clock. Those relationships. And those relationships are really based on tradition. Consequently, we have got to see, as Aharonian very aptly, our community, I'm talking not ethnicity is not a viable term. It's going to die. But community, cultural community, if you ask me, religio-cultural community. Those are the terms, and these are a necessity for the United States. We don't all become Roman Catholics or Italian Roman Catholics. We don't all become Italian Polish. We don't all become Hispanic Catholics. We don't all become this or that. after all, past, if it's really viable tradition has also a future for itself, provided it knows how to be a living tradition and adapt itself to change without destroying the axis of identity around which all change revolves like a helix. Builds up. As life goes on, I increase my tradition, I develop my tradition, but it's always around an axis. And this sort of society, communities, we are able, and the others are able, the Polish are able, and the Hispanics are able, and all the other rest are, not only they are able, but they have been able. It's our past tradition. Not only in this country, in all other countries. So there is no, as soon as we begin to define our terms and give a clear picture, an image of what we are thinking about, we'll find our path. I'm not sure.
All right, one final question perhaps, or two?
Yes, I find the bishops, the archbishop's injunction to be more conscious of definitions very proper. And in fact, that's why exactly I'm referring to Ralph Myrick's with me. I wanted to use more irregular constructs. And I think that our next conference, if Mahmoud is interested next year, we can start our conference and address some of the same problems at a more rigorous theoretical level, where we can deal with some of these definitional problems and deal with some of the more complicated problems that John raised. Because when we talk in terms of comparative analysis, for example, American pluralist theory and the role of the communal or ethnic Kooshian. And then we need to talk about consociational theory in Belgium and in Switzerland and so on. Now these are pretty high-powered, sophisticated theoretical constructs. And we need definitions, therefore, at the beginning of the conference before we proceed. So much for the future.
Okay. Final question.
Archbishop Thernstrom just mentioned that history is frozen. And I have to ask, I don't believe that history is frozen. I think that history is created by people at a moment in time to reinterpret their past in a way that they wish their history to be. And when Dr. Bamberger has been trying to reconstruct our history, I'm very interested in your comments about the role of men and women in the family in our past. I want to ask if there has been some contradictory evidence that you come up against that might suggest a different interpretation of the past family, and that is that it may not necessarily be adequate to say that it was patriarchal, but that perhaps men and women had different realms or domains within which they were dominant, and that perhaps women, for example, we often hear about Armenian women as matriarchs, and when the patriarch would pass away, the Armenian woman would have a strong role in the family. That maybe it would be that women and men obtain more power within their realms or dominion at the age in Armenian society. And that we could look at it that way rather than as one being subservient. That's the implication when I hear patriarchal.
Yes, no, you're absolutely right. I was giving you the stereotype which I got from my informants, and most of that was could have been put in quotation. I also believe, as you do, that there must have been a very small women's line within the household. And I've been trying to figure out why there has been, for a very long time, a strong and large number of professional Armenian women throughout the world, people who have really risen to the top of their profession. There must have been something in that family that helped develop those possibilities for women. But I haven't yet uncovered it. Perhaps the mother-in-law wasn't as harsh as has been depicted, and encouraged the young daughter-in-law. Or perhaps the mother, before the girl was married out, it gave her all that she needed to go ahead in life. I really haven't solved any of these problems.
That's a recent development. That is not historically true. You couldn't support what you're saying historically. The woman's role has only become dominant as a recent phenomenon. You go back even just before the early 1900s. I can't think of any incidents, I can't remember anybody giving me any stories or telling me any kind of scenario where the women were predominant in any sense whatsoever.
You know, I've heard that, and I've also heard people saying, for example, it was different in the village and in the town and in the city, and that those differences also were significant.
If I could just say a closing word on this, I agree with the spirit of your comment that history is always open to reinterpretation, but your specific formulation, which you may not stand by, but I think any historian would wince at the notion that we must always reinterpret history as we wish it to have been. Thus, you know, no Holocaust, thus no massacres. Are nothing but...
As they wish, you know, as they wish it to be perceived. I'm not saying consciously even, but that is the effect of it. Otherwise, there would not be so many different interpretations.
Well, I would argue the view that there is some grain of objective truth. My mentor and Bob Myrack's mentor, Oscar Hanlon, has written a book called Truth in History, and most historians do think there is some element of sort of objective truth and that we can get closer to it with the proper documents. But in any case, I thank you all. It was a fascinating session.
Yeah, before I lose the audience, remind you again that if you have not done so, inform the registration desk that you are present. We would like for our statistical study to know who is attending, how many sessions, and which sessions in particular. I imagine at this point